Late one rainy afternoon, I stepped into my favorite cafe, a modest, tucked-away spot on a quiet side street where the comforting aroma of fresh coffee mingled with the low hum of whispered conversations. I settled into my usual corner seat with a book, expecting nothing more than a peaceful escape from the dreariness of the day. That's when I first saw him, a man sitting alone at a table near the window. At first glance, he appeared entirely unremarkable, a neatly dressed stranger in a light blue sweater, his expression neutral as he sipped black coffee. Yet, as I glanced up from my book, our eyes briefly met, and I couldn't shake the feeling that his gaze held something deeper, something unsettling. I brushed it off as a trick of the light, or perhaps my own overactive imagination. The next day, while waiting at the bus stop on my way to work, I distinctly recognized that same man. He stood a few feet away, partially hidden under the brim of a dark cap, his posture relaxed as if he belonged there. I watched him out of the corner of my eye, and when our glances met again, a chill ran down my spine. I convinced myself it was merely coincidence, a stranger who happened to frequent the same neighborhood. However, that thought quickly dissolved when, later in the week, I saw him again at the local grocery store. There, amid the fluorescent lights and everyday chatter, he lingered near the produce section. His eyes seemed to track my every move as I selected apples and negotiated prices with the cashier. Each time our eyes met, his smile was slight but knowing, and it felt as if he were silently acknowledging secrets that only he could understand. Over the following days, the sightings became disturbingly routine. I'd catch glimpses of him in places and moments where his presence defied simple chance. At the park on a brisk early morning run, I noticed him seated on a weathered bench beneath a towering oak tree. He was reading a dog-eared book, and as I passed, he looked up and nodded almost imperceptibly. Later, during a late evening stroll along a rain-slicked sidewalk, I saw his silhouette reflected in the glass of a closed storefront, standing just where I would never expect him. Each encounter, though brief and seemingly innocent, chipped away at my sense of safety. I began to notice other unnerving details, too. Small items began appearing in unexpected places. An unremarkable paperclip left on my desk at work, a handwritten note tucked into my mailbox that simply read, "I see you." No one else seemed to notice these oddities, and when I mentioned them to colleagues or friends, they assured me it was nothing more than an overactive imagination or a prank played by a mischievous acquaintance. Yet the unease grew, turning into a constant, heavy presence in my mind. Every time I stepped outside, I felt as though unseen eyes were following me, measuring my movements and silently recording every detail. One particularly unsettling evening, I decided to confront the situation. Determined to put an end to these eerie coincidences, I lingered near the entrance of a dimly lit bus station, scanning the crowd for any sign of him. Sure enough, I spotted his familiar figure leaning casually against a pillar. Mustering my courage, I walked over and greeted him with a tentative hello. He regarded me with calm, almost detached interest, replying, "Good evening. Enjoying the night?" His tone was soft and conversational, but the disarming normalcy of his words clashed violently with the mounting dread inside me. I tried to ask if we had met before, but he only smiled, shaking his head slowly as if amused by my confusion, and excused himself with a polite nod. The encounter left me more troubled than reassured. Since then, every outing has been a careful exercise in vigilance. I alter my routes and change my routines, hoping to break this relentless pattern of appearances. Yet he persists, appearing in a crowded subway car, lingering near my apartment building, even showing up at a friend's dinner party when I'm not expected. His behavior is always subtle, a fleeting glance, an offhand remark, the odd compliment that feels far too personal. I've started to record these encounters in a small journal, desperate to discern a pattern or to prove to myself that I'm not losing my grip on reality. But the entries only amplify my sense of isolation and paranoia, each line a testament to a reality that grows stranger by the day. Now, as I sit alone in my dimly lit apartment, the weight of these inexplicable encounters presses down on me. Every creak of the floor, Every murmur of wind outside my window seems to whisper his name. I can't help but wonder if I am merely the unwitting subject of someone's obsessive plan, a puzzle piece in a narrative that I never chose to be part of. Each time I venture out, I live with a gnawing fear that at any moment he might be waiting just around the corner, his eyes fixed on me, silently orchestrating my every move. Am I being stalked? Or am I spiraling into a paranoia born of chance encounters that my mind has twisted into something sinister? I can no longer tell if these events are nothing more than a series of unnerving coincidences, or if there is truly someone out there, quietly and relentlessly watching me. It started with small things, subtle shifts I could have easily dismissed as tired eyes or a fluke of memory. I moved into my new apartment last fall, excited for a fresh start. The place was exactly as described, a modest one-bedroom in a quiet complex, with familiar furniture and a layout that promised stability. On my first day, I meticulously arranged my belongings. My favorite armchair by the window, the coffee table centered in the living room, and a stack of books on the shelf in the hallway. Everything was in its rightful place, or so I thought. A few weeks in, I began noticing peculiar changes. One evening, I returned from work and found the armchair, which I had always left by the window, positioned in the middle of the room. I distinctly remembered placing it against the wall. I told myself I must have moved it in a moment of distraction. The next morning, however, as I sipped coffee at the table, I noticed the mug I'd set down was not where I'd left it. It was now on the windowsill, staring out at the street. At first, I wondered if I was simply losing focus, but the incidents became too regular to ignore. Then came the whispers of alterations in my environment that no one else seemed to perceive. One day, I discovered a small smear on the side of the bookshelf, a pattern of scratches that hadn't been there the day before. I ran my fingers over the marks. They felt deliberate, as though someone had traced a message. When I mentioned it to a neighbor while chatting in the courtyard, she simply smiled politely and said, "Oh, that's always been there, dear." Her dismissive tone made my skin crawl, and I began to question whether I was the only one noticing these subtle shifts. At work, things started to feel equally disjointed. I had been at the office for years and knew every inch of our break room. Yet recently, I'd swear the clock on the wall was showing a time that didn't match what I remembered. Conversations with co-workers grew stilted. Familiar faces began repeating phrases or referencing events in ways that didn't quite add up. One colleague, usually warm and spontaneous, recited his greeting in the same measured tone every single morning, as if his words were pre-recorded. When I asked if anything was wrong, he simply laughed it off, saying, "You're overthinking it." But I wasn't overthinking. I felt an undeniable change that extended beyond my imagination. I started to document every anomaly in a battered notebook. I recorded when objects were in places I didn't recall leaving them, and even noted when familiar phrases were spoken with an unsettling precision. One entry read, "Found the remote on the kitchen counter at 8:47 p.m. when I left it on the sofa an hour ago." Another mentioned a door that I was certain I'd locked suddenly found open. As I scribbled these details, I began to wonder if my memory was betraying me or if something else was at work. The disturbances grew bolder. One rainy evening, I came home to find a handwritten note stuck to my front door. In shaky script it read, "Nothing is permanent." I felt a chill as I read it. It was as if someone wanted me to notice. I asked the building manager if any other tenants had received odd messages, but he insisted that nothing unusual had been reported. I confided in my best friend over the phone, describing every detail, yet she dismissed my concerns, saying I was just stressed from the move. Inside my apartment, the pattern of inexplicable changes escalated. I would leave a personal item, a photograph on the mantle, a scarf draped over a chair, and hours later find it in a different location. Sometimes I even encountered the same object multiple times, untouched in places I never remembered placing it. The most disturbing moment came one night when, lying awake in bed, I heard a faint sound in the hallway. I crept out of my room and, to my horror, saw my bookshelf rearranged. The books were in a different order, their spines forming shapes I couldn't decipher. In the dim light, I thought I saw words carved into the wood, a message that vanished as soon as I blinked. Desperation clawed at me as I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head. I began questioning every detail of my day. I started leaving video recordings of my apartment to capture the changes, but every playback showed only minor, fleeting differences that I couldn't pin down. The world around me felt increasingly hostile, as if it were deliberately rewriting itself, while everyone else remained oblivious. Friends and family insisted that nothing was different. The apartment, the office, even the familiar street outside my window. Everything was as it had always been. Yet I could feel it, an undercurrent of instability, a creeping sense that reality was fragmenting around me. Now, as I sit alone in the quiet of the night, I can't shake the feeling that I am trapped in a world that others can't see, a reality that shifts imperceptibly, piece by piece, until nothing remains certain. I stare at the objects in my room, each one a potential sign that the place I once trusted is slipping away, morphing into something unrecognizable and coldly deliberate. I'm left with an unrelenting question. Am I losing my mind? Or is there something far more sinister orchestrating these changes, leaving me isolated in a reality that only I seem to notice? The truth remains elusive, and every night I lie awake, wondering if tomorrow I'll wake up to a home that is entirely alien, a place that mocks my every attempt to hold on to what I once knew. And so I continue, trapped between what is real and what is fading into an unsettling illusion, with the lingering dread that perhaps I'm the only one who sees the cracks in this world, a world that feels increasingly hostile and impossibly mutable. I first met him on what I assumed was an ordinary evening in a city that was new to me. I had arrived in Crestwood on a business trip, a place where the streets hummed with quiet energy and the locals wore smiles as if they held secrets. I was staying at a small hotel off a tree-lined avenue when I encountered Marcus, a friendly man in his late 30s with an easy demeanor and a laugh that sounded genuine. We struck up a conversation in the hotel lobby, and he seemed to know just the right things to say. He complimented my choice of book, mentioned a few must-see places in town, and even asked about my plans for the weekend. At first, I took comfort in his warmth. It was refreshing to meet someone who appeared so naturally kind in a city where I knew no one. Over the next few days, Marcus's presence became a recurring, inexplicable part of my trip. I would see him in the cafe near the hotel, always seated in the same corner, his eyes following me as if he were silently cheering my every decision. One morning, as I hurried out for a business meeting, I caught him leaning against a lamppost, nodding in my direction with an almost knowing smile. I tried to dismiss the feeling of unease that stirred within me. Perhaps it was just a coincidence. I reasoned that two people with similar schedules should cross paths repeatedly in a small town. But then, the details began to pile up in ways that defied simple chance. During a quiet evening at a local bistro, Marcus approached my table as if he'd been invited by some unspoken understanding. Over dinner, he made offhand remarks that unsettled me deeply. He mentioned a detour I had taken earlier that day, a route I had chosen spontaneously to avoid traffic, and described it with an intimacy that made my stomach churn. "I know that road well," he said softly, his eyes glinting under the candlelight. I tried to laugh it off, insisting it was nothing more than a lucky guess, but the words echoed in my mind long after the meal was over. Soon, I began noticing that he seemed to know personal details that I had never shared. One afternoon, while waiting for a meeting to start at the hotel's business center, I overheard him mentioning my name and commenting on an event I'd casually mentioned to the receptionist. I thought back to that conversation. Had I really said all that? And yet, here was Marcus, recounting my own words as if they were public knowledge. My pulse quickened with a mix of paranoia and disbelief. I started to question whether I was simply being forgetful, or if someone was intentionally blurring the boundaries of my privacy. Each encounter grew progressively more disconcerting. I began to see him at times and places when I least expected it. In the reflection of a store window as I rushed out for groceries, sitting silently in a park bench during an early morning jog, or even lingering near the entrance of the conference center where I'd present later that week. His timing was uncanny. Each appearance coincided with moments when I felt most vulnerable, as if he were measuring my emotional state with meticulous precision. It wasn't just his presence that unnerved me. It was the subtle hints in his conversation. Once, as I was waiting for an elevator in the hotel, he casually remarked, "I heard you just changed your plans for the evening. That new restaurant you mentioned must be interesting." I hadn't even mentioned that to anyone else. His voice was gentle, almost compassionate, yet laden with an intensity that left me reeling. Desperation set in as I tried to make sense of the situation. I began retracing my steps, jotting down every encounter in a small notebook. I noted the time, location, and every odd detail. The precise way he described my route, the cryptic compliments about my choices, and even the fact that his gaze seemed to linger on me with an unnerving familiarity. I searched through my memory for any plausible explanation. Had I inadvertently shared more about myself than I realized? But nothing added up. Marcus's behavior seemed too calculated, too intimate for casual conversation. Late one night, after a particularly unsettling day, I returned to my hotel room and found a small slip of paper tucked under my door. It read only, "I know you." My hands trembled as I held the note, the weight of those two simple words pressing into my thoughts like a warning. I called the front desk, demanding to know if anyone had been near my room, but they assured me nothing unusual had occurred. I felt isolated, trapped in a reality that was simultaneously mundane and deeply sinister. Now, as I sit in the quiet darkness of my temporary room, every creak of the floor and distant murmur of the city seems imbued with meaning. I've spent the past few days desperately searching for logical explanations, replaying conversations, checking security cameras in the hotel, even discussing the matter with a trusted colleague back home. Yet every piece of evidence only deepens the mystery. I can't help but wonder if Marcus is merely an overly observant stranger, or if he is part of something far more deliberate, an unseen force tracking my every move. Perhaps I was lucky to be noticed at first, a momentary connection that turned into an obsession I never sought. Or maybe, in this world where coincidences blur into calculated encounters, I have unwittingly become part of someone's elaborate design. The line between chance and intention has grown impossibly thin. Every time I step out into the cool night air, the lingering thought gnaws at me. Is it simply a case of mistaken identity and peculiar coincidences, or is there truly someone following me, gathering the intimate details of my life one encounter at a time? I can't decide if my mounting anxiety is the result of my own overactive imagination, or if there is an unsettling truth hiding behind Marcus's kind smile. And as I stare out the rain-streaked window, I am left with the unsettling possibility that I may never know the answer. Only the haunting knowledge that in a world full of secrets, perhaps I'm not as invisible as I thought, and somewhere someone is watching. I first noticed something was off on an ordinary Tuesday. I had lost my wallet, a careless misplacement, I assumed, as I retraced my steps from the grocery store to my apartment. After a frantic search, I found it tucked behind a loose brick on the building's exterior wall, as if someone had returned it. I chalked it up to a coincidence, a random act of kindness, or maybe even my own absent-mindedness. But as the week unfolded, the small oddities multiplied until my life began to feel strangely disjointed. It started with everyday items. My keys would vanish from their usual bowl, only to reappear on the dining table. A letter I was sure I had mailed ended up on my doorstep, unopened. I scribbled notes in a journal, trying to map out a pattern, but the inconsistencies were as fleeting as smoke. I mentioned it to a coworker, who dismissed my concerns with a tired smile and a shake of their head. "You're just stressed," they said. "It happens to everyone." Yet, deep down, I felt increasingly like a spectator in my own life, as if the events around me were being edited when I wasn't looking. One evening, while I was watching TV in my living room, I caught a glimpse of someone standing in the reflection of my window, a figure that vanished the moment I turned to look directly. I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks after a long day, but the unease refused to leave. The next day, I visited my neighbor, Ms. Jensen, who had always been warm and chatty. When I brought up the reflection, her eyes flickered with something I couldn't decipher. Reflection? "I don't know what you mean," she said with an odd indifference, as if the incident were nothing more than a trivial matter. Her response only deepened my anxiety. As days bled into weeks, the strange occurrences grew bolder. I began noticing that conversations with people left gaps. A friend would reference a joke from earlier in the day as if it had never happened, and colleagues would pause mid-sentence, their eyes glazing over, before continuing as if nothing was amiss. One afternoon, I received a text from a number I didn't recognize. It was a photo of the same park bench where I had found my lost wallet, taken at precisely the time I had been there. The accompanying message simply read, "Did you really forget?" The cryptic note sent a shiver down my spine, and I couldn't help but wonder if someone was deliberately altering my memories. Late that night, I began to document these anomalies with a small voice recorder, hoping to catch some rational explanation in the background noise. But when I listened back, I heard not only the hum of the refrigerator and the distant murmur of traffic, but a faint, rhythmic tapping that seemed to echo my own heartbeat. At first, I dismissed it as the sound of the old pipes in the building. Yet, as the tapping persisted and grew louder on some nights, I felt as though I were being timed, measured against some unseen metronome that dictated the pace of my reality. The most unsettling incident occurred on a rainy evening. I stepped out for a walk to clear my head, navigating slick, dimly lit sidewalks. As I passed a familiar storefront, I caught sight of my reflection in the window, a reflection that didn't quite match me. The eyes in the glass were distant, almost hollow, and for a brief moment, my reflection smiled back with a smirk that I was certain I hadn't made. I spun around, half expecting to see someone standing behind me, but the street was empty. When I tried to recount the experience to a passerby, they looked at me blankly, as if my account was a riddle they'd never heard before. Each day, the fabric of my life frayed a little more. My journal filled with entries that oscillated between meticulous notes of mundane happenings and frantic scribbles of events I could no longer explain. I began to doubt my own sanity, wondering if I was slipping into a waking nightmare where reality was being rewritten when I wasn't paying attention. The people around me seemed to forget shared moments almost immediately, their memories fleeting as if being selectively erased. I felt adrift, trapped between what I knew and what I was beginning to suspect might be a far more sinister force at work. Now, as I sit alone in the dim light of my living room, the steady drip of rain outside punctuating the silence, I struggle to reconcile the events of the past weeks. I have proof, recordings, photos, and detailed notes, but they only deepen the mystery. Is it all a figment of my stressed mind? A series of coincidences that have piled up until they feel impossible to ignore? Or is there something more deliberate, a shadowy presence subtly manipulating the reality around me? I write these words with trembling hands, knowing that tomorrow might bring another inexplicable shift, another moment where I'm forced to question if I am truly living my own life or merely watching it unfold like a well-rehearsed play. I leave you with this question, as unresolved as the mysteries that now define my everyday. Am I losing my grip on reality, or is something else, something beyond my understanding, controlling the narrative of my life? The answer remains elusive, hidden in the spaces between memory and oblivion, as I continue to watch, wait, and wonder. It began with a feeling, a quiet, unnameable sensation that something was slightly off in an otherwise ordinary day. I left my apartment as usual, coffee in hand, expecting the world to greet me with its predictable routine. Yet, as I stepped out, I caught sight of a familiar blue sedan parked on the street. I was sure I hadn't seen that car yesterday, even though every detail of my morning commute felt routine. I shrugged it off as a mere coincidence, a stray vehicle that had just appeared, and continued on my way. Later that morning at work, I returned to my desk and noticed something unsettling. My favorite mug, one that had always sat in the same spot on the table, was there exactly as I'd left it. But hours later, after a brief absence when I stepped out for lunch, it remained undisturbed, precisely where it had been since I arrived that morning. It wasn't that I had left it untouched. I distinctly remembered reaching for it in the afternoon. I frowned, a flicker of doubt crossing my mind, but told myself I was simply misremembering. Throughout the day, little glitches continued to reveal themselves. On my walk home, a passerby in a gray coat repeated the same wave and nod I'd seen just minutes before, as if their actions had been copied and pasted from an earlier moment. At the grocery store, I found myself drawn to the same aisle, where the products on the shelves were arranged in an order I could have sworn had been rearranged the day before, even though nothing about that aisle had changed in weeks. My thoughts raced. Was the world subtly reordering itself around me, or was my memory betraying me? As the days wore on, these anomalies grew more persistent and harder to ignore. Every evening when I returned home, I would glance at a particular item, a small, decorative clock that hung above my mantel, and note with quiet astonishment that it was exactly where I'd left it earlier, yet somehow its position or even its angle seemed imperceptibly different. I began to document these occurrences, scribbling notes in a battered notebook I kept by my bed, hoping to find a pattern. The entries were a series of minor, unsettling repetitions. A car seen twice on the same block, an object that appeared unaltered despite my recollection of moving it, even snippets of conversation with neighbors that echoed as if replayed from a previous day. One evening, as I sat in the dim light of my living room watching the clock's second hand tick in its steady rhythm, I experienced what I can only describe as a temporal hiccup. I distinctly remember setting the table for dinner, only to leave the room for a moment and return to find everything exactly as I had arranged it. But then, as I sat down, the scene repeated. The same conversation with my roommate played out a second time in my mind, the same words lingering in the air with the same cadence, as if I were watching a recording of a moment that was meant to be unique. My heart pounded as I realized that the repetition wasn't limited to isolated objects. It was seeping into the fabric of my day, blurring the lines between what I experienced in real time and what seemed to be a replay of moments I thought I'd lived only once. I started to question my own sanity. Were these glitches merely tricks of my perception, or was there something far more disconcerting at work? Every time I tried to rationalize the occurrences, the anomalies multiplied. I began noticing subtle changes in familiar environments. The park bench I sat on during my morning walk sometimes bore a faint scuff mark that wasn't there before. The streetlights outside my window seemed to flicker in patterns that defied any logical sequence. Even the voices of people around me occasionally sounded as if they were looping, their words caught on repeat. One particularly disconcerting incident occurred on a rainy Thursday. I had left the office feeling unusually drained, and as I walked to the bus stop, I saw that same blue sedan from before parked right at the corner. Its presence was impossible to ignore, as if it had been waiting for me. I sat on the bench, glancing at it repeatedly, feeling the gnawing certainty that I had seen it countless times that day, even though I distinctly remembered passing it only once. When the bus arrived and I boarded, I caught a glimpse of a reflection in the window, a faint outline of a figure standing behind me, then vanishing as quickly as it appeared. The sense of déjà vu was overwhelming. I began to feel that the day was looping, that reality itself was caught in a cycle that I was powerless to break. At home, in the quiet solitude of my apartment, I confronted the escalating strangeness. I stared at my reflection in the mirror, questioning if my own face was beginning to warp with the repetition of time. I reread my notebook, the entries growing increasingly frantic and repetitive, words echoing like a broken record. In that solitary moment, the idea that everything around me might be fake, a meticulously programmed simulation with glitches that repeated themselves without my consent, started to crystallize in my mind. What if I wasn't just observing these anomalies, but was part of a larger system in which my every action was predetermined, looping endlessly like a corrupted file? The realization sent a chill through me. The comfortable reality I had known was fragmenting into a series of repetitive patterns, a sequence of events that repeated without variation. I began to see myself not as an independent actor in a vibrant, unpredictable world, but as a cog in a malfunctioning machine, a glitch in the matrix. I couldn't shake the feeling that every moment, every object, every conversation was being replayed, not because of my memory failing me, but because reality itself had become an endless loop of repetitions. Now, as I sit in the silence of my apartment, the hum of the city outside reduced to a distant murmur, I feel the weight of the inescapable truth. The world I once trusted as real may have been nothing more than an illusion, a carefully constructed simulation with broken code. The familiar details of everyday life, the blue sedan, the perfectly arranged clock, the recurring voices, are all fragments of a system that no longer obeys the laws of linear time or spatial logic. I have come to understand that I may have become part of this anomaly, an unwitting participant in a cycle I cannot escape. And as I stare into the darkness, I wonder if it even matters whether this reality is genuine or simply a repeated sequence of glitches. Because in the end, the very nature of existence might be nothing more than a malfunction, a loop that I am doomed to live in forever. I moved into my new apartment on a chilly October evening, expecting a fresh start in a building that seemed ordinary enough, a modest complex with worn carpet and peeling wallpaper, nothing out of the ordinary. The first few days were normal. I unpacked my belongings, arranged my furniture just as I liked it, and settled into a routine that promised stability. Then, one evening, as I returned from work, I noticed something odd. My living room lamp, which I had always placed on the end table beside the couch, was sitting on the coffee table instead. I stared at it for a long moment before convincing myself that I must have moved it absent-mindedly. I shrugged off the unease and went about my night. The next morning, while making breakfast, I found my favorite mug not on the shelf where I always left it, but on the kitchen counter instead. Again, I told myself it was a simple mistake. But over the following week, these small discrepancies began to multiply. A painting I had hung on the wall in a carefully chosen position was now slightly askew, as if nudged by an unseen hand. I began finding tiny smudges on surfaces that weren't there before, scratches on the wood of my desk, or faint marks on the floor near the doorway that looked almost like words. When I mentioned these oddities to my neighbor, Mrs. Hargrove, she simply patted my hand and said, "You're imagining things, dear. Old buildings play tricks on the eyes." Her words did little to ease the mounting sense of disquiet in my chest. At work, things were equally unsettling. I noticed that conversations with my colleagues would sometimes start off as usual, but then one of them would repeat a phrase exactly the same way I remembered hearing it the day before. It was as if our words were being recorded and replayed on a loop. One afternoon, during a routine meeting, my coworker Jason told a story about a camping trip that sounded eerily identical to a tale I had shared with him just a week earlier. When I confronted him about it, he looked at me with a puzzled smile and said, "I'm not sure what you mean. I don't remember that conversation." I left the meeting with my mind reeling, unsure if I was losing my memory or if something far stranger was happening. The real turning point came one rainy night. I was sitting in my living room, trying to relax with a book, when I glanced at the clock on the wall. It read 10:37 p.m., the exact time I had returned from a late shift that night. But then, as I watched, the second hand seemed to hesitate, as if time itself were stuttering. My heart pounded as I set the clock aside and forced myself to focus on the pages in front of me. But the uneasy feeling wouldn't leave me. I sensed that something was not right, that the very fabric of my reality was beginning to unravel. Over the next several days, the changes grew more pronounced. I'd come home to find my furniture subtly rearranged, as if a careful hand had shifted each item ever so slightly. A chair moved a few inches closer to the window, a book left open on the table with words highlighted that I hadn't marked. One night, I discovered a handwritten note tucked under my door. It read, "Everything repeats." I felt my pulse quicken. I asked around, but no one else had seen anything like it. Even when I showed the note to Mrs. Hargrove and a couple of friends, they dismissed it as a prank or a mistake. I started to document everything in a journal, noting each strange incident with precise detail. The time I found objects moved, the odd reoccurrence of phrases, the inexplicable marks left on surfaces. But even my records seemed to betray me. Some days, I would read an entry and find that the details had subtly changed: the description of the room, the order of events, the emotions I had felt. It was as if my memories were being edited by an unseen hand. I began to doubt my own sanity, questioning whether the changes were truly happening or if I was the one altering my recollections. Late one night, I awoke to a sound, a faint, almost imperceptible tapping coming from the hallway outside my bedroom. I lay frozen, listening as the sound repeated in a steady rhythm. Mustering enough courage, I crept to the door and peeked out. The hallway was dark and empty, yet the tapping persisted, echoing from somewhere I couldn't pinpoint. I shut the door, heart hammering, and lay back down, the sensation of being watched burning in my mind. The final blow came on a morning that began like any other. I prepared for the day, got dressed, and left my apartment, but something felt profoundly wrong. As I passed by the building's common areas, I noticed a subtle but undeniable change. A painting that I had seen hanging in the lobby was now replaced by a photograph of a desolate landscape I didn't recognize. A voice in the back of my mind whispered that nothing was as it should be, that the world around me was shifting into something unrecognizable and hostile. I tried to tell myself that it was just coincidence, that I was overreacting to trivial changes, but the feeling grew stronger with every step I took. Now, as I sit alone in my apartment tonight, the silence is punctured by the quiet hum of my thoughts and the persistent fear that something is watching, waiting for the next moment to alter my reality again. I glance around at the familiar objects that now seem strange and out of place, each one a reminder that I can no longer trust my own senses. The world outside appears unchanged, ordinary even, but inside, I feel an insidious shift, a creeping, inexorable force that is rearranging everything, piece by piece, until I'm left wondering if I've become trapped in a loop of subtle terror that no one else can see. I've come to understand that these events are not just coincidences or figments of my imagination, but part of something far darker, something that defies explanation. And as the night deepens, I'm left with a chilling realization that I might never escape this slowly encroaching madness, a reality that is slipping away from me, leaving me isolated in a world that is both familiar and utterly alien. I woke up on what should have been an ordinary morning, the soft buzz of my alarm and the steady glow of early light creeping through the blinds. I swung my legs off the bed and, as usual, reached for my phone on the nightstand. But as I glanced at the time, something felt off. The digital display read 7:17, yet I distinctly remembered it being 7:16 just before I fell asleep. I brushed it off as a minor discrepancy, perhaps a lag in the device, and went about my routine. On the bus ride to work, I sat in the same spot I always did, watching the familiar scenes pass by outside the window. That's when I first noticed him, a man in a navy jacket sitting 2 rows ahead. I was sure I'd seen his face before, but when I turned to catch his eye, he was gone. I tried to shake the feeling off, attributing it to a trick of my tired mind. Yet, as the day unfolded, small details kept slipping from the realm of normalcy. At the coffee shop near my office, the bright red awning I'd always associated with the place had been swapped for a deep blue one. The chairs outside were arranged in a new pattern, and even the menu board bore a slightly different font. I asked the barista if they'd renovated, but she merely smiled and said, "It's always been like this," as though nothing had changed at all. I left with a growing sense of unease that something was not quite as it should be. Back at work, my desk remained in its usual spot. Yet as I settled into my chair, I noticed a small photo frame on my monitor that I was sure I'd never put there. It was a picture of a serene lakeside scene, tinted with an otherworldly hue. I reached for it, half expecting it to vanish, but it stayed firmly in place. My co-workers carried on with their tasks as if nothing was wrong. Only, their conversations and expressions seemed to loop in a repetitive cadence. One colleague, who normally joked with me about weekend plans, repeated a story I distinctly remembered hearing earlier that day. When I pointed it out, she just shrugged and said, "I always tell that story." As the days turned into weeks, the small glitches began to accumulate. I started carrying a notebook, determined to document every instance of the inexplicable. I scribbled down oddities, a clock that fell an extra minute behind, street signs that appeared to change names between my morning walk and my evening commute. Even the way the grocery store's layout seemed subtly different every time I visited. I noted with mounting trepidation that certain faces repeated in unexpected places. A man with a peculiar scar whom I saw not only on the bus, but also waiting outside my apartment, and a woman whose laugh echoed precisely in the same tone on different days, as if her dialogue were pre-recorded. One evening, I returned home to find my living room rearranged. My coffee table, which I remembered placing in the center of the room, now sat flush against the wall, and the books on my shelf were in an order I had never organized. I stood there, heart pounding, and reached out to adjust a picture frame on the wall. The frame wavered in my hand, as though it had been slightly off balance all along, and when I set it down again, it seemed perfectly aligned. Yet, deep inside, I knew something was terribly wrong. The glitches intensified. One night, as I sat watching TV, the screen stuttered, displaying the same scene over and over in a rapid loop before finally resuming normal play. I started to feel as if I were caught in a repeating moment, a cycle that I could neither break free from nor fully understand. My notebook entries began to contradict themselves. Details I had written one day were inexplicably altered by the next. It was as though the fabric of reality was being rewritten in front of my eyes. Then came the day when I realized I wasn't the only one who was affected, at least not in my memory. A coworker casually mentioned that they'd seen a stranger outside the building who looked exactly like the man I'd been spotting on the bus. But when I asked for details, they insisted they had never seen him at all before, as if his presence was only noticeable to me. Conversations started overlapping, as if people were speaking lines from a script they'd memorized, repeating events in a loop without deviation. I tried to confront the situation logically. I began altering my routine, taking different routes to work and visiting new cafes, hoping that if the glitches were mere coincidences, they might resolve themselves in a more diverse setting. But the anomalies followed me, as if the world itself were glitching, rewriting its own code. At night, as I lay in bed, I would sometimes glimpse a faint flicker in the corner of my eye, a momentary distortion in the dark that vanished the moment I focused on it. The sense of repetition grew heavier with each passing day, the boundaries between what was real and what was artificially arranged blurring until I could no longer tell. One evening, while recording my thoughts on my phone, I heard a faint, looping sound behind me, a voice reciting the same phrase over and over. "This isn't how it's supposed to be." I spun around, but the room was empty, the only evidence a series of static blips on my recording. I reviewed the footage and saw nothing but the grainy distortion of a face that looked almost like my own, trapped in an endless loop of repetition. Now, as I sit here in the dim light of my cluttered apartment, I feel a growing resignation. The glitches have become so interwoven with my daily life that I can't imagine a return to the normal reality I once knew. Every day I wake to find subtle changes. Rearranged furniture, repeated faces, familiar routines that now feel like pre-scripted lines in a never-ending play. I realize with a chill that I may have become part of the glitch itself, a character in a story where the script is constantly being rewritten by forces I can neither comprehend nor escape. The more I search for answers, the more elusive they become. What if reality isn't a stable, unchanging ground at all, but a series of overlapping loops and repeated glitches? An elaborate simulation where every moment can be reset, adjusted, or simply ignored. I no longer know if my experiences are mere coincidences or if the fabric of the world has fractured beyond repair. In the quiet moments of the night, as the familiar hum of the city outside blends with the distant sound of static, I wonder if tomorrow I will wake up to a world completely altered, a world where I am no longer in control, where I have become nothing more than an error in a broken matrix. And so I continue, each day a patchwork of repeated events and minor anomalies, living in a reality that feels increasingly synthetic, increasingly preordained. The realization dawns on me. I may never return to what I once called normal, because normal itself has become a relic of the past. In this ever-shifting loop, I am left with one inescapable thought. I've likely become part of the glitch, forever trapped in a world that has broken down into an endless cycle of repetition and uncertainty. It began on an ordinary Tuesday morning as I left my apartment for work. The city was waking up, and I followed my usual route, barely noticing the rhythm of everyday life. But as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, a slight dissonance in the familiar cadence of my routine. I stopped at my favorite coffee shop, the one with the mismatched chairs and the persistent hum of the espresso machine, and ordered my usual latte. The barista, Mia, greeted me with a smile that seemed just a fraction too forced. And when I glanced out the window, I saw a flash of movement, a figure crossing the street in a way that felt almost pre-programmed, as if the same scene had played out before. I tried to dismiss it as a trick of the light or my overactive imagination. Yet later that day, as I sat in a meeting at work, I found myself glancing repeatedly at the clock. Every minute felt stretched, as if time itself were lagging, and I began to notice subtle inconsistencies. My coworker James, usually chatty and animated, delivered his presentation in a monotone, his gestures mechanical, as though he were reading from a script he'd recited countless times before. When I asked him about it later, he only smiled and said, "Just a long day, huh?" But something in his eyes told me that wasn't enough. That evening, as I returned home on the bus, the sensation of déjà vu grew stronger. The bus driver seemed to follow the same route he always did, yet there were moments when I could swear he paused at a stop that didn't exist on the schedule. Outside, familiar landmarks blurred together. A park bench that should have been in one place appeared elsewhere, and the streetlights flickered in a pattern that felt deliberate, as if they were counting seconds in a loop. I began to wonder, was I caught in a glitch, a brief malfunction of reality? At home, I tried to reestablish some normalcy. I sat at my desk and opened my journal to record the day's events. But as I flipped through the pages, I discovered that some entries were repeated word for word, as if the same day had been written twice. The handwriting was mine, but the repetition was unsettling. I felt like I was reading the same story over and over, with only the tiniest variations in punctuation or phrasing. It was as if I were trapped in a loop that I couldn't escape. Over the next few days, the glitches became more pronounced. One morning, I woke up to find that my bedroom clock had stopped at exactly 6:42 a.m., though I distinctly remembered setting it moments earlier. In the kitchen, a bowl of fruit I had left on the counter was rearranged into a pattern that I had no recollection of making. A perfect circle of apples and oranges that looked more like a ritual than a random assortment. My phone, which I kept as a lifeline to reality, began displaying notifications for events I never remembered scheduling. And when I checked my calendar, I found blank spaces where important meetings should have been noted. I started to experiment, deliberately altering my routine. One afternoon, I took a different route to work, one I had never traveled before, hoping to break the cycle. Yet every turn led me back to a street that looked identical to the one I had just left, as though the city itself were reordering its pieces to confound me. I began to record my journey on my phone, but the footage itself glitched, frames repeated, and moments of static interspersed with the smooth flow of everyday life. I even caught a glimpse of my own face in a store window, but it lagged behind my movements by a split second, like a corrupted video file struggling to catch up. At work, I confronted a few co-workers about the strange occurrences, but every conversation ended the same way, with a casual dismissal and a suggestion that I was simply stressed or tired. James insisted nothing was wrong, and even Mia, when I mentioned her odd smile that morning, merely laughed and said, "You're imagining things." Their words offered no solace. If anything, they deepened my isolation. It was as though I were the only one who could see the cracks in the veneer of normalcy. Then, one night, I experienced what felt like the ultimate break in reality. I was alone in my apartment, the silence broken only by the low hum of the refrigerator. I sat on my couch, staring at the TV that played an endless loop of static, when I heard a sound, a faint, rhythmic tapping, as if someone were knocking in sync with the beat of a metronome. I followed the sound to the hallway, where I discovered that one of the wall sconces had changed its position. It wasn't that I'd moved it. It was as if it had shifted on its own. I reached out to touch it, half expecting it to vanish under my hand, but it remained firmly in place, mocking my confusion. I began to question everything. Had I become part of a larger system, a glitch in the matrix of our reality? Each new anomaly chipped away at the stability of the world around me. I started noticing repeated phrases in conversations, snippets of dialogue that seemed to echo from one moment to the next. At the grocery store, I overheard two strangers discussing a news report that I knew hadn't even been broadcast yet. In the park, a couple walked by, their conversation looping in a way that suggested they were stuck in a moment of déjà vu. Everywhere I looked, I saw hints of a broken world, a system malfunctioning in ways I couldn't fully grasp. I began to fear that the reality I once trusted was nothing more than a facade, a meticulously programmed simulation with errors that only I could perceive. The more I searched for answers, the more the pieces refused to fit together. I scoured online forums for others who might share my experiences, and while a few users claimed similar oddities, their stories were fragmented and filled with uncertainty. No one could provide a concrete explanation, only more questions. Now, as I sit in my darkened room, the hum of my computer the only sound breaking the silence, I stare at the blinking cursor on a blank document. I feel an overwhelming sense of isolation, as if I'm the only one who can see the underlying code of the world around me. The glitches, the repeated moments, the subtle rewrites of reality. I can no longer tell if I'm living in a coherent world or merely a broken simulation, where every day is a rerun and every interaction is predetermined. I'm not sure if I've become part of something much bigger, a test subject in a cosmic experiment, a character in a story being rewritten by unseen forces, or if reality itself is simply shattered, leaving me stranded in an endless loop of uncertainty. One thing is clear: something is deeply, irrevocably wrong, and I can't shake the feeling that I'm caught in a glitch that will never end. The normalcy I once knew has been replaced by a relentless stream of repeated errors, each one a reminder that the world I inhabit is far from stable. And as the static on my screen dances in eerie patterns, I wonder if tomorrow will bring any new answers, or if I will simply awaken to the same fractured reality over and over again, until I can no longer tell where the glitch ends and my life begins. I moved into my new apartment a few weeks ago, a modest one-bedroom on a quiet side street that I assumed would be a fresh start. The place was exactly as advertised, with neat, unassuming decor and a layout that felt comforting in its familiarity. On my first day, I spent hours arranging my furniture just as I'd planned, placing my favorite armchair by the window and setting a small lamp on the side table. Everything felt perfectly normal. Yet, on the second day, as I returned from work, I noticed something odd. The armchair was not where I had left it. It sat squarely in the middle of the room, as if it had been deliberately repositioned. I paused, blinking in disbelief, and assumed I must have moved it in a moment of distraction. I reset it, dismissing the occurrence as a lapse in memory. The following week, subtle changes began to accumulate. One morning, I found an unsigned note taped to my refrigerator. In neat handwriting, it simply read, "You belong here." I felt a chill, but rationalized it as a careless prank by a neighbor or a previous tenant. Later that day, I noticed the bookshelf in my living room had shifted. Books that I distinctly remembered lining the left wall were now arranged on the right. At first, I thought I had reorganized them in a rush, but I was meticulous about my habits. Each time I returned from a brief absence, I found my surroundings slightly altered. A vase relocated to an unusual spot, a cushion turned to face the opposite direction. Even the digital clock in the hallway showed the same time it had when I left, yet its display flickered ever so slightly. I began to document these occurrences in a small notebook, scribbling down every detail, dates, times, and the exact position of every piece of furniture I could recall. The entries were meticulous, yet even they started to exhibit oddities. One page described the layout of my living room exactly as I remembered it, only for the next day's entry to include a detail that wasn't there before: a faint, almost imperceptible smudge on the corner of the table, or a whisper of a message carved into the wood that I swore I hadn't noticed. I started questioning whether these were real changes or tricks of my imagination. Then came the day that shattered my illusion of normalcy. I returned home after a long day at work, expecting the quiet solitude I had grown accustomed to. Instead, I found the door slightly ajar, though I was certain I had locked it. Inside, nothing appeared amiss at first glance. I flipped on the light and walked into the living room. My eyes were drawn to the mirror hanging above the mantel. Something was different. In the reflection, the room looked identical, yet behind me, in the peripheral vision, a dark shape lingered. I spun around, heart pounding, only to find the room empty. The sense of being observed tightened around me like a vice. That night, I barely slept, haunted by the persistent feeling that the apartment was not static, that it was slowly shifting around me. Over the next several days, the changes grew more pronounced. I would leave a cup on the table in the morning, only to return in the afternoon and find it replaced by a different one, a cup with unfamiliar markings that I was certain I had never seen. I caught glimpses of messages scrawled on walls and corners of the hallway. Single words like change, reset, or again, as if someone or something was communicating with me in code. The most disconcerting moment came when I noticed that the layout of my apartment itself seemed to rearrange. The door that led to my bedroom, which I had always known to be on the right side of the hall, now appeared to be on the left. I retraced my steps, confused and increasingly terrified, only to find that nothing else had moved, except for the door. I began to wonder if I was trapped in some kind of closed loop, a shifting alternate reality where every time I blinked, something was different. The familiar had become unstable, and with each return, the place I called home was not quite the same as the one I remembered. I tried to reach out to friends, to ask if anyone else had experienced such anomalies, but they dismissed my concerns as overactive imagination or the stress of a new environment. No one else noticed the subtle displacements, the recurring messages, or the inexplicable changes in layout. I was alone in this labyrinth of shifting reality. Now, as I sit here in the dim light of an evening that seems to echo with the same quiet hum of uncertainty, I realize that the world around me may be nothing more than a carefully constructed illusion, a loop that resets and rearranges itself without my consent. I no longer trust my own memories or my sense of place. Every object, every message, every misplaced piece of furniture whispers that the reality I once knew is breaking down, that I have become a participant in a system far larger and more unnerving than I ever imagined. I'm not sure if I can ever return to normal, or if this endless cycle of subtle glitches is now my only reality. And so I sit, questioning whether it even matters. If our perceptions are mere fragments of a program designed to keep us confined in an ever-changing, inescapable loop. I first met Alex on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday morning as I waited for the bus. He stood a few paces away, leaning against the lamppost in a tailored jacket and a smile that was both warm and unsettlingly ambiguous. At the time, I assumed he was just another commuter, but something about the way he looked at me, like he already knew me, stuck with me. That day, as I climbed aboard the bus and found a seat, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd seen him before, even though I was sure I hadn't. The next day at work, I was surprised to see him again. Alex had joined our department as a new colleague, introduced with a casual "Hi, I'm Alex." His voice was familiar in a way I couldn't place, and his face carried that same disquieting expression. Over the following weeks, I began to notice small, inexplicable anomalies. At lunch, I would step out to grab a coffee and, upon returning, find that the break room's layout had inexplicably changed. The chairs rearranged, the bulletin board with new, unfamiliar notices. At first, I blamed my distracted mind or a mere oversight on my part, but the glitches grew too consistent to ignore. One afternoon, while reviewing emails at my desk, I suddenly felt a jolt, as if I had skipped several minutes of time. I looked at the clock. It read 2:37 p.m. I distinctly remembered it being 2:29 only moments ago. When I asked a coworker what time it was, he insisted it was always been 2:37 since lunch ended. My internal alarm began to ring, and I started keeping a small notebook, jotting down every strange incident. Lost hours, rearranged objects, repeated conversations that felt slightly off. Alex's presence became increasingly prominent in these moments. I'd catch sight of him in hallways, in reflections on glass surfaces, and even in the peripheral corners of crowded rooms. Yet every time I confronted him about it, he would simply smile and say, "Funny how things just happen, isn't it?" His responses were measured, as if he were reciting lines from a script, and his appearance seemed to shift ever so subtly. Sometimes his hair was darker. Sometimes his eyes seemed to hold a trace of something unplaceable. One evening, I left the office a bit later than usual and found myself inexplicably on a street I didn't remember. The familiar storefronts and sidewalks had been replaced with new, surreal details. A mural on a wall that depicted impossible landscapes, a lamppost that flickered with erratic pulses of light. I retraced my steps, but every turn I took led me deeper into streets that seemed to exist in parallel to the one I knew. It was as if time and space were being rewritten around me, and I was trapped in a loop where moments slipped by without notice. That night, as I sat in my apartment trying to regain some sense of normalcy, I reviewed my notebook. I found entries that contradicted my own memories. Notes about conversations I never had, meetings that I knew I missed entirely, and even descriptions of Alex that varied from day to day. One entry, scrawled hastily in the margin, read, "Time is not linear. Neither are we." The handwriting was unmistakably mine, yet I couldn't recall writing it. The final fracture in my reality came one morning when I awoke to discover my apartment's layout had shifted imperceptibly during the night. The bookshelf that always lined the left wall now rested on the right, and personal items that I was certain I had placed in a particular order were now scattered in a pattern I couldn't explain. I searched every room, questioning the very fabric of my memory, only to be met with the same disconcerting absence of logical answers. I began to suspect that the glitches were not isolated incidents, but part of something far larger, a pervasive anomaly woven into the tapestry of my daily existence. Alex appeared in these moments with increasing frequency, his role shifting from that of a new colleague to a silent observer of my unraveling reality. His once friendly demeanor now carried an eerie weight, as if he were aware of the changes unfolding around me, and perhaps even orchestrating them. Now, as I sit alone in the dim glow of my living room, I stare out at a world that no longer feels constant. The clock ticks in uneven intervals, and memories blur into one another like frames in a corrupted film. Every day, I encounter the same disconcerting glitches. People I swear I've met before, events that repeat with minor but unsettling variations, and the persistent, shifting presence of Alex, a figure who seems to defy consistency, mirroring the distortions in my reality. I've come to a haunting realization. The world I once knew may have been nothing more than an illusion, a carefully constructed simulation that is now breaking down before my eyes. I no longer trust the continuity of time or the solidity of space, for every moment carries the possibility of being rewritten. I fear that I have become an integral part of this anomaly, a glitch in the matrix where nothing is as it seems, and every familiar face is a sign that reality is unraveling. In this ceaseless cycle of repetition and change, I wonder if I will ever find my way back to a world that feels real, or if I am doomed to exist in this ever-shifting loop, forever uncertain of what is genuine and what is merely a fleeting error in the code of existence. I never imagined that an ordinary evening could spiral into a waking nightmare. It all began on a cool autumn night in 2017, when I was settling into my modest two-bedroom apartment on the edge of town, a place that, at first glance, seemed perfectly normal. I had just moved in after a long search for a fresh start, and the idea of having my own space filled me with excitement and hope. The building was old, with creaking floors and a few quirks here and there, but nothing out of the ordinary. That night, as I unpacked a box of books in my living room, I distinctly heard what sounded like soft footsteps echoing from the hallway. I brushed it off as the building's settling, a common occurrence in older structures, and resumed my work. Over the following weeks, subtle anomalies began to weave into my daily routine. Sometimes, I'd leave my apartment and return to find small items, notebooks, a coffee mug, Even a framed photograph moved from where I'd left them. I questioned my memory at first, blaming exhaustion and the chaos of a recent move. Yet, a nagging feeling persisted that I wasn't the only one inhabiting this space. One chilly evening, after a long day at work, I came home to discover a folded scrap of paper on my doormat. The note, typed and unadorned, simply read, "I see you." I was unnerved. Though rationally, I tried to convince myself it was a cruel prank or an attempt at dark humor by a neighbor. But as the days turned into nights, my initial disbelief gave way to a profound sense of dread. It escalated quickly. Late one night, while trying to sleep, I was awoken by the sound of whispering. So faint I couldn't make out any words, but unmistakably human. My heart pounded as I listened in the darkness, convinced that the voices were coming from somewhere inside the apartment. I mustered the courage to get up and check, but every room appeared empty and undisturbed. The whispers, however, left a residue of terror that clung to me long after they had ceased. I began keeping a meticulous journal of these events, noting times, places, and my ever-growing anxiety. I even installed a small camera in the living room, hoping to capture evidence that might explain the disturbances. When I reviewed the footage, I saw nothing but the gentle sway of shadows in the low light, except for one clip that chilled me to the bone, a momentary glimpse of a dark, indistinct figure standing in the doorway, its face obscured by shadow. The real turning point came on a rainy Sunday afternoon. I had gone out to the local grocery store, a routine errand I had made countless times before. As I loaded my cart with supplies, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced around and noticed a man standing a few feet away, casually observing me. His attire was unremarkable, a plain blue jacket and jeans. But there was something about his intense, unblinking gaze that set my nerves on edge. When I passed by, he smiled faintly and nodded, as if acknowledging me. I felt a jolt of discomfort, like a premonition of something sinister. I told myself it was a coincidence, that perhaps he was simply being friendly, but the encounter left an imprint of unease. Back at home, the occurrences grew ever more perplexing. I started to receive strange, seemingly unsolicited phone calls in the middle of the night. Silent calls that ended as soon as I answered, leaving only a low static hum on the other end. On one particularly harrowing evening, I returned to my apartment to find my front door slightly ajar. The building's security cameras recorded nothing unusual, and the police dismissed my report as a case of wind or my own absent-mindedness. Still, I couldn't shake the terror that someone or something had been inside silently watching me. Then came the night I can never forget. I had been trying to force sleep, but around 3 a.m., I awoke to a persistent, low thud coming from the kitchen. Bleary-eyed, I crept out of bed and edged toward the sound, my pulse racing. The kitchen was dark except for the faint glow of the refrigerator. As I reached the doorway, I saw a fleeting shadow dart across the far wall, a movement too deliberate, too controlled to be the result of a random gust of wind. I fumbled for the light switch, and in that brief moment of illumination, I thought I saw a figure standing by the pantry. I couldn't be sure. It might have been a trick of the light or my own overactive imagination, but I felt an overwhelming surge of terror and helplessness. I locked every door and window, determined to secure myself from an intruder I couldn't see. In the weeks that followed, I scoured online forums and local history archives in search of any explanation for the inexplicable events in my apartment. I discovered that the building had a shadowy past. A tenant had disappeared under mysterious circumstances nearly 30 years ago, leaving behind unanswered questions and whispered rumors of a presence that refused to leave. The more I learned, the more I feared that I had unwittingly become entangled in that same dark legacy. Despite moving my belongings and changing my routines, the disturbances only grew bolder. The whispers returned, now occasionally accompanied by a faint, almost sorrowful sigh. Objects began to vanish and reappear in places they clearly had not been moved by me, and I often woke up at odd hours with the distinct sensation of being watched. I still have no logical explanation for what happened during those terrifying months. I've discussed it with friends and even a few skeptical paranormal investigators, but no one can definitively say why I was targeted or what force was behind the invasive phenomena. The events were all too real, each incident marked by tangible details that no rational mind can easily dismiss. Even now, whenever I find myself in an empty room with the lights dim, I can't help but feel that unseen eyes are lingering in the corners, silently questioning my every move. I share this story not for sympathy, but as a stark reminder that sometimes the most inexplicable horrors occur right under our noses, in the places we trust to be safe. I still wonder, what did I disturb in that old building? Was it merely the residue of past tragedies, or did I invite something far more malevolent into my life? I know one thing for sure. What happened to me was real, and I will never forget the terror of knowing that there are some things in this world that defy explanation, leaving us to grapple with the terrifying question of why. It started with small things, so small in fact that I barely noticed at first. I'd put my phone down on my nightstand, only to find it in the kitchen hours later. I'd wake up with a distinct feeling that I had forgotten something important, only to realize I had no idea what that something was. Just little oddities, easily dismissed. Then, time started slipping. The first time it happened, I thought I was just exhausted. I sat down to read one evening, the warm glow of my lamp casting long shadows across the room. The next thing I knew, I was standing in my kitchen, the lights off, the room steeped in darkness. My book was still in the living room, my tea long since gone cold on the table. I had no memory of getting up, no recollection of walking across the apartment. It was like I had blinked and teleported. Sleep deprivation, I told myself. Maybe I was zoning out more than usual, distracted by stress. I tried to ignore it, but the gaps in time kept getting longer. One afternoon, I left my apartment to run a few errands. I remember stepping out the door, locking it, feeling the keys in my hand, and then nothing. The next thing I knew, I was back in my apartment, sitting on the couch, watching a TV show that I didn't remember turning on. The groceries I had intended to buy were nowhere to be found. I checked my phone to see how long I had been gone, but there were no new timestamps, no missed calls or texts, nothing to indicate where I had been. I started keeping notes, a small notebook where I documented every single thing I did throughout the day, from the moment I woke up to the moment I went to bed. If I lost time, I could check my notes, piece together what happened. It felt like the only way to keep control. But then, the notebook started changing. I wrote down everything. Every meal, every conversation, every insignificant action. And yet, when I went back to read it the next day, some entries weren't the way I remembered writing them. Entire sections were crossed out, sentences rewritten in handwriting that looked like mine, but wasn't quite right. One morning, I flipped to the last page and found a note I didn't remember writing. It was in my handwriting, sure, but the words sent a sick feeling twisting in my gut. Don't trust them. Don't let them in. Them? Who was them? I started questioning everyone around me. My co-workers seemed normal, until I realized they kept asking me the same questions over and over, as if they didn't remember we had already talked. My best friend, who had always called me every night to chat, started speaking in an oddly detached tone, as if she was reading from a script. And then there was my neighbor, an old woman who had lived in the building for years. One morning, she greeted me in the hallway with a warm smile and a kind wave. That evening, she passed me again, wearing the exact same clothes, with the exact same smile and the exact same wave. A perfect, identical repeat. That's when I stopped leaving my apartment after dark. I started recording myself at night. I needed to know if I was moving around in my sleep, if I was the one altering my notes. The first few nights were uneventful. Just the soft sounds of me turning over in bed, breathing quietly. But on the fourth night, at exactly 3:12 a.m., the video glitched. Just a flicker of static, no more than a second. When the image returned, my bed was empty. I stared at the screen, my breath caught in my throat. The footage continued. Nothing moved. The room remained still, eerily silent. Then, at 3:19 a.m., the video glitched again, and suddenly I was back in bed, lying on my side as if I had never left. I stopped watching the footage after that. By now, the missing time wasn't just happening at home. I'd find myself on streets I had no memory of walking down, in stores I had no intention of visiting. I checked my phone only to find pictures in my gallery. Photos of dark alleyways, empty highways, grainy shots of people I didn't recognize. I tried deleting them, but they always reappeared. One night, I woke up standing in my own living room, facing the window. The city outside was quiet, the glow of streetlights casting long, distorted shadows across the pavement. I had no idea how long I had been standing there. My reflection in the glass looked wrong, not because it didn't resemble me, but because it did. It was too exact, too still, like a photograph. And then, it blinked. I ran out of the room, slammed the door, locked myself in my bedroom, and didn't move until morning. I don't know what's happening to me. I don't know if it's something inside me, something outside of me, or if I've simply lost my grip on reality. The gaps in my memory have become unpredictable. I keep waking up with new entries in my notebook, pages filled with frantic, looping scribbles of words that don't make sense. You are not alone. They know what you did. You are not supposed to be here. I don't know what they mean. I don't know who they are. But the worst part is I don't think I'm the only one writing in the notebook anymore. A few days ago, I found a new entry at the bottom of the page. The handwriting wasn't mine. It was too precise, too mechanical, too deliberate. We're almost ready. I don't know what that means. I don't want to know. This morning I called my friend, the one who used to call me every night. I told her I was scared, that I needed to get out, that something was wrong. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then, in that same detached, eerily calm voice, she asked, "Where do you think you're going?" I hung up. I don't know if this is real anymore. I don't know if I'm being watched, if I'm being controlled, or if something else is inside me, pulling the strings, moving me like a puppet. But one thing is certain. I'm no longer the only one living in my own body. It started with my keys. One evening, I came home from work, tossed them onto the kitchen counter like I always did, and went about my routine, changing into comfortable clothes, heating up leftovers, scrolling on my phone. But when I went back to grab my keys to move my car to a better parking spot, they were gone. I checked the counter, the floor, the pockets of the jacket I had just taken off. Nothing. I spent nearly an hour looking for them, growing more and more frustrated until, finally, I found them sitting neatly on my nightstand. I chalked it up to exhaustion. Maybe I had absent-mindedly taken them to the bedroom without realizing it. Maybe I was just distracted. That was the first time. Then it started happening with other things. My phone charger, which I always kept plugged in next to my bed, would disappear, only to turn up in the bathroom. My favorite mug would vanish from the dish rack, and later be found inside a kitchen cabinet I barely used. I even lost a book I was in the middle of reading, only for it to reappear days later, sitting in the exact same spot where I had last seen it. At first, I blamed myself. Maybe I was getting forgetful. Maybe I wasn't as careful as I thought. But then things started appearing that I knew weren't mine. One morning, I woke up to find a single silver spoon in my kitchen drawer that I had never seen before. It didn't match my set. It was slightly tarnished, the design on the handle unfamiliar. I live alone. No one else had access to my apartment. Still, I reasoned it away. Maybe I had accidentally grabbed it from a takeout order, or maybe I had forgotten about it. But then there were the footprints. One evening, after coming home late, I noticed something strange on the floor. A faint trail of muddy footprints leading from the front door to the middle of the living room. They weren't mine. I checked my shoes. They were dry and clean. The prints were too small, too narrow, like they belonged to a child. I stood frozen for what felt like forever, staring at them, feeling my skin prickle with an unnamed fear. They stopped abruptly in the center of the room, as if whoever made them had simply disappeared. I checked every lock, every window. Everything was secure. Nothing else seemed out of place. There was no sign of forced entry, no indication that anyone had been inside. I convinced myself it had to be a prank. Maybe dirt had been tracked in somehow. Maybe I was overthinking it. I cleaned the prints, locked my bedroom door that night, and tried to push the unease away. But the next morning I found them again. Same small, narrow prints. Same odd stopping point in the middle of the room. I took a picture this time, desperate for proof. I sent it to my sister, my best friend, anyone who might have an explanation. But everyone I talked to brushed it off. Maybe you're just noticing them now, one friend said. Maybe you walked through something and didn't realize it. But I knew, because that night I saw something. I had woken up around 3 a.m., my throat dry, my body heavy with exhaustion. As I sat up to reach for the glass of water on my nightstand, I froze. The closet door was open. Just a crack. I never leave it open. Something inside me told me not to move, not to breathe. My mind screamed at me that I was being ridiculous, that it was just my imagination. But I felt something in that room with me. I could feel the air shift, the weight of a presence just beyond my vision. And then, in the dim glow of my bedside lamp, I saw it. A shape, a figure, low to the ground, almost curled into itself. Not quite visible, but there. I didn't move. I didn't blink. And then, so slowly I could barely comprehend it, it crawled backward, slipping into the darkness of the closet. I shot up, slammed the door shut, and didn't sleep for the rest of the night. By morning, the closet was empty. Nothing inside but my clothes, my shoes, my belongings. No sign that anything had ever been there. But I knew what I saw. I started sleeping with every light on. The next day, I called the landlord, asking if anyone had ever reported strange occurrences in my unit. He laughed and told me no, but hesitated before adding, "That place has had a few tenants come and go pretty quickly. People don't stay long, but no one ever says why." I didn't tell him what was happening. What was I supposed to say? That I thought something was moving my things? That I thought I saw something crawl out of my closet? I decided I needed to get out. Maybe I was imagining things, maybe I wasn't, but I couldn't stay. I started packing that evening. That's when I found the drawings. Crumpled, yellowed pieces of paper tucked beneath my couch. Childlike sketches, drawn in black crayon. Figures standing in a row, long-limbed, hollow-faced. And in the center, a single figure, curled into itself, hiding in the dark. I left that night. I don't know what was in that apartment, if it was ever really there at all. I still tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that the missing objects, the footprints, the thing in the closet, none of it was real. But sometimes, in the middle of the night, when I wake up to silence and stillness, I feel it again. That presence, watching, waiting. I never imagined that the strangest terror would come from within. It started subtly enough, small lapses that I attributed to stress or a lack of sleep. I was working late one night when I noticed a gap in my memory. I distinctly remembered making a cup of tea, yet when I reached the kitchen an hour later, no tea bag or mug was there. At first, I chalked it up to exhaustion, but then the omissions began to multiply. One morning, I woke up and realized I couldn't remember how I had ended up in a park I'd never been to. The walk home was a blur of foggy moments, and when I asked a passerby for directions, they looked at me as if I were confused about my own address. As the days passed, I started to notice that not only was time slipping away from me, but so was control over my own actions. I catch myself in the mirror with a slight, disconcerting change, a twitch in my smile, a look in my eyes that wasn't entirely mine. Friends began to remark that I seemed different. My best friend, Laura, mentioned that I had started repeating things I never said before, as if I were speaking words scripted by someone else. I brushed it off, insisting it was just a byproduct of exhaustion, but the feeling gnawed at me persistently. It escalated in ways I couldn't explain. One afternoon, I was in the middle of an important phone call with my boss when I suddenly blanked out. I remember the conversation, clearly up to the point where I lost several minutes, a gap during which I'm sure I did not speak. When I resumed talking, my tone was colder, my words more calculated, as if I were reciting a rehearsed monologue. Later, I reviewed the voicemail of a colleague who had called me during that time, but there was nothing on the line, only silence where there should have been a confused apology or an explanation. Then came the changes in those around me. People I had known for years began to act as if they were unaware of shared memories. Laura, who had always recalled our long, late-night conversations, now said she didn't remember talking about certain topics with me. My coworker Mark, whose jokes I used to cherish, now delivered them in an offhand, robotic manner, almost as if he were reading lines off a script. It wasn't that they were being rude. They seemed genuinely unaware of the shift, leaving me isolated with the creeping suspicion that I was the only one left with these memories intact. One night, while lying awake in bed, I felt a heavy presence, as if unseen eyes were watching me from within the darkness of my room. The sensation wasn't physical. It was more a profound sense of intrusion, as if my very thoughts were being monitored. I tried to shake off the feeling, but then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On my bedside table, among the scattered papers and notes I had scribbled down about my missing minutes, was a photograph of me taken earlier that day. The picture showed me standing in my living room, but I had been in bed the entire time. The timestamp on the photo was exactly when I was supposed to be asleep. I began to document every detail obsessively, writing down hours, minutes, and every errant word I could recall uttering. But no matter how much I wrote, the gaps persisted. Some days, I would find entire pages of my notebook inexplicably blank, as if the words had been erased. I started to suspect that not only was something stealing pieces of my day, it was also altering my memories, rewriting them so that I couldn't trust what I remembered. The most disturbing incident occurred on a rainy evening when I returned home after what should have been a normal day at work. As I entered, I immediately sensed that something was wrong. My apartment was dimmer than usual, and the shadows in the corners seemed deeper, more menacing. I walked into the living room and froze. There, on the coffee table, lay a small note written in a handwriting I didn't recognize. "You are not in control." I stared at it for what felt like hours, the words burning into my mind. I tried to dismiss it as a cruel prank, but deep down I knew it wasn't. Since then, the feeling of being watched, of having my actions manipulated by an unseen force, has only intensified. I can't shake the conviction that something is orchestrating these events from within me. Sometimes I find myself sitting in silence, waiting for a sudden burst of movement in my limbs, a twitch that isn't mine, a pause in my speech that comes from somewhere else. I feel like I'm living in a world where the boundaries between my will and an external command have blurred, where my decisions are no longer my own. I have sought help from professionals, tried to explain the phenomenon to friends, but all I've received are polite smiles and dismissive reassurances that stress and lack of sleep can do strange things to one's mind. Yet every day, I feel that subtle invasion more acutely. Every missing minute, every altered memory, every uncanny change in the way people speak to me is a reminder that I might not be the master of my own actions. I lie awake at night, haunted by the possibility that I'm being controlled by something that resides in the shadows of my consciousness, something that is rewriting reality from within. Now, as I write these words in a moment of rare clarity, I am left with an overwhelming sense of dread. I may never fully understand what is happening to me, and I fear that even if I do, the truth will be more horrifying than I can imagine. The lines between my thoughts and someone else's commands have blurred into a tangled web of manipulated time and altered memories. And so I remain trapped in a state of perpetual uncertainty, never quite sure if the terrifying moments I experience are entirely my own or if I am merely a puppet, controlled by an unseen force. I can only hope that one day I'll find the answers, but until then, the chilling thought lingers. I may never escape the feeling that I am not truly in control, that something from outside is always watching, always waiting to take over my life. I first noticed something was off on a chilly October evening. I had returned to my small apartment after a long day at work, expecting to settle into the familiar comfort of home. As I stepped through the door, however, I found my keys resting neatly on the living room table, a table where I was certain I had left them on the entryway console. I paused, puzzled, and set my bag down. Surely, I must have absent-mindedly placed them there. I tried to shrug it off, but an uneasy feeling began to creep in. Over the next few days, small anomalies started accumulating. One morning, my favorite mug, which I always arranged on the shelf above the desk, was inexplicably on the kitchen counter. Another evening, I discovered that the books on my coffee table had been reordered, as if someone had taken the time to sort them by color. At first, I chalked it up to my forgetfulness or a lapse in my routine. But when the same inexplicable changes recurred, my wallet mysteriously shifted from the entry table to the sofa cushion, and a picture frame I had adjusted the day before was found rotated 90 degrees. It became impossible to ignore. I began meticulously documenting every occurrence in a worn notebook kept on my desk. I noted the time, the object in question, and its new location. The entries were precise, yet soon I started finding discrepancies. In one entry, I wrote about a small scratch on the dining table that I was sure had never been there before. In another, I recorded that a faint set of footprints had appeared in the hallway, leading from the front door to my bedroom, even though I lived alone and had never had visitors. I told myself that these were coincidences, trivial details that my mind was exaggerating. But deep down, an unsettling dread was taking root. One night, as I sat alone in the dim glow of my living room lamp, I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. I was watching a movie, or so I thought, when I suddenly heard a faint scratching sound coming from the wall behind me. I froze, listening intently. The sound was rhythmic and deliberate, like someone or something was tapping out a pattern. I turned on every light in the apartment, even opening the closet door to check, but there was nothing there. The sound eventually faded, leaving me with an oppressive silence and the nagging thought that I wasn't alone in my own home. The phenomenon didn't stop there. Over the following weeks, the disturbances began to take on a more disturbing scale. One evening, I returned from work to find a series of cryptic messages written in what looked like charcoal on the back of my front door. The words were smudged and barely legible, but one phrase stood out: "It's not a mistake." I asked my neighbor if she had seen anything unusual, but she only gave me a puzzled look and insisted her door had been securely locked all night. Even my best friend, when I recounted the events over a late-night phone call, dismissed them as stress-induced hallucinations. But I knew what I had experienced. Then, one night, as I was preparing for bed, I noticed that the digital clock on my bedside table was flickering wildly between times. I watched in horror as the display cycled through numbers: 2:47, 2:48, then back to 2:45, over and over, as if it were stuck in a loop. In that moment, I felt as though time itself was unraveling, slipping through my fingers like grains of sand. I sat there, paralyzed, as the realization set in that the changes in my surroundings were not isolated incidents. They were connected, a pattern emerging from the chaos. I began to suspect that my entire world was shifting in ways I couldn't comprehend. Objects moved without any human intervention. Subtle marks and messages appeared in places I had never seen them before, and even my own recollections seemed to blur. I found myself doubting the reliability of my memory. Had I really placed my keys on the table that day, or was it someone else? I'd rearranged the furniture in my living room one evening, only to return the next day and find it set up differently, as if a hidden hand had intervened. The more I tried to rationalize these occurrences, the deeper my anxiety grew. I scoured online forums, searching for any mention of similar experiences, but all I found were vague theories and dismissed paranormal accounts that sounded too fantastical to be true. I began to feel isolated, trapped in a reality that was slipping away from me, one small glitch at a time. My notes grew frantic, filled with descriptions of events that defied explanation, and I started to wonder if I was being watched, manipulated by forces beyond my control. One evening, after a particularly long day filled with inexplicable disturbances, a door left ajar that I was sure I'd locked, a favorite chair that had moved to a different corner of the room, I sat down in my living room, heart pounding, and stared at the silent walls. In the quiet, I began to feel that these events were not random, but part of a larger, unexplainable picture. It was as if my home, the very space I trusted to be my sanctuary, had become a stage for a recurring, sinister performance. Every small change, every missing object, every strange message was a clue in a puzzle that I couldn't solve. Now, as I write these words, I can't help but wonder, is it all in my head? Or is there something more behind these events? A presence or a force that is gradually erasing the familiar and replacing it with something unknown and unsettling. The unanswered questions leave me with a lingering sense of dread. I have no logical explanation, no way to prove that what I'm experiencing isn't real. Yet every day, as I return to my apartment, I brace myself for the next small, inexplicable change. Each one a reminder that my reality is slipping away, fragmenting into pieces I can no longer piece together. And deep down, I fear that something far scarier is waiting. A truth that might reveal that the world I knew was nothing more than an illusion, a delicate facade about to shatter into darkness. It began on an ordinary Thursday morning when I walked into the little cafe on the corner, a cozy spot I'd frequented for months. I ordered my usual latte and found a seat by the window, hoping to lose myself in the muted chatter and soft clinks of cups. As I settled in, I noticed a man seated at a corner table. He was unremarkable in most respects, dressed in a simple gray jacket, his hair a bit tousled, his eyes focused on a dog-eared book. But there was something about the way he looked up and held my gaze for just a moment that sent a subtle chill down my spine. I tried to dismiss it as a quirk of my imagination, the product of a half-awake mind on a slow morning. A few days later, I was taking my routine evening walk in the nearby park when I saw him again, this time sitting on a bench beneath a cluster of old oak trees. He was alone, engrossed in a thick newspaper, but when our eyes met, he offered a slight, almost knowing nod before returning to his reading. I wondered if it was merely a coincidence. After all, the park was a popular spot. Yet, as the days passed, the pattern became impossible to ignore. One afternoon, while waiting in line at the grocery store, I caught a glimpse of him in the reflection of the freezer doors. His face was momentarily visible before he stepped away, and I swear that his eyes held an intensity that felt far too personal. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was just another local, perhaps even a regular like me. But the nagging sensation of being watched grew with every subsequent encounter. Over the next week, I started to notice him in places I'd never expect. I saw him at the bus stop during my early morning commute, leaning casually against the shelter as if he belonged there. I even spotted him across the street from my apartment building one night, standing under a flickering street lamp. Each time, he seemed to appear without fail, his presence both unobtrusive and unervingly persistent. At first, I hoped it was all coincidence, a series of random, unrelated moments. But the mounting frequency of these encounters left me with a deep, unshakable anxiety. Then came an encounter that shattered any remaining semblance of normalcy. One crisp autumn evening, as I was walking home from the library, I saw him waiting at the entrance to a dimly lit alley. His posture was relaxed, his expression neutral, yet the sight of him in that unlikely spot sent my heart racing. I quickened my pace, trying not to draw attention, but a moment later, as I paused at an intersection, he stepped forward. His greeting was soft, a polite good evening, but his eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made it clear he knew more about me than a stranger should. I mumbled a brief reply and forced myself away, my mind reeling with questions and dread. That night, I discovered something that I couldn't easily explain. When I returned home, I found an envelope tucked under my door. Inside was nothing but a single printed photograph of the very cafe where we'd first crossed paths. In the background of the shot, clearly visible despite the low quality of the image, he was there, sitting as if waiting for me. The realization that I had been unwittingly observed so precisely, that my movements were being tracked in this silent, methodical manner, was deeply unsettling. Desperate for answers, I began to document every encounter in a small notebook. I jotted down dates, times, locations, and even my feelings at the moment, each entry filled with the same recurring sense of violation. I changed my routine, taking different routes, avoiding my usual haunts, but no matter what I did, the man's presence remained persistent. There were times when I'd see him in passing, a flash of a gray jacket in a crowded street, a pair of eyes in the window of a bus, always watching, always waiting. Other times, he would appear to strike up a conversation in the most innocuous way, a compliment here about the weather, a question there about a book I was reading. Small interactions that, while seemingly benign, carried an undercurrent of something more calculated, more invasive. The psychological toll began to mount. Sleep became elusive, and every shadow in my apartment's corners or reflection in a shop window made my heart skip a beat. I started feeling as though I were a character in someone else's meticulously crafted script, a pawn in an elaborate game whose rules I could neither see nor understand. Even when I was surrounded by friends or immersed in work, the nagging sensation of his watchful eyes gnawed at me, leaving me unable to fully trust the world around me. I reached out to a close friend and confided my fears in whispered details. She listened with concern, but ultimately suggested that I might be overreacting, an anxious mind interpreting coincidences as something sinister. But how could it be mere chance that I encountered the same man at a cafe, then a park, then on my commute, and finally near my home, always in moments when I was most vulnerable? Every instance felt too deliberate, too pointed to be random. Now, as I sit alone in my dimly lit living room, the sound of my own breathing is punctuated by the occasional creak of the floor, as if the house itself were alive and echoing the uncertainty of my thoughts. I've grown accustomed to the constant urge to look over my shoulder, to scan every passerby for that same familiar face. The once comforting routines of my life have been hijacked by an overwhelming sense of being part of someone's obsessive plan, an unwelcome narrative that I never agreed to participate in. I can't help but wonder, is this just a series of coincidences amplified by my own growing paranoia? Or is someone truly stalking me, deliberately inserting themselves into every facet of my life? The thought haunts me as I write this, a question that leaves my mind spinning in uncertainty. The stranger, with his unervingly calm demeanor and perfectly timed appearances, could very well be nothing more than a figment of my anxious imagination. Or perhaps, somewhere out there, he's real, and he's watching, waiting, and planning his next move. I first noticed him on a rainy Tuesday when I was leaving work. At the time, I assumed nothing of it. A man in a worn jacket waiting at the bus stop, his posture relaxed as he scrolled through his phone. His presence was entirely unremarkable, and I hardly spared him a second glance. Over the next few weeks, however, our paths began to cross more frequently, and I started to sense something amiss in the way he carried himself. At first, it was subtle, a slightly too intense gaze across a crowded hallway, an oddly familiar smile exchanged during casual greetings. I told myself it was nothing more than the quirks of urban life, a case of mistaken identity or an overactive imagination fueled by the stress of daily routines. It wasn't until a few encounters later that his behavior started to deviate from the norm. I met him again at a local coffee shop where I'd taken refuge on a particularly dreary afternoon. As I sipped my latte and attempted to lose myself in a book, he appeared to be reading the room. His eyes kept lingering on me, and when I looked up, he offered a compliment that struck me as both precise and unsettling. "You have a very calming presence," he said, his tone soft yet laden with a disconcerting intensity. It was as if he'd taken note of something deeply personal, something I hadn't even acknowledged about myself. I brushed it off, attributing it to an overly friendly stranger, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that his interest extended far beyond casual politeness. Over time, his inquiries grew more personal. At work, he found ways to initiate conversation during breaks, casually asking about my weekend plans, my family, and even my hobbies. The questions, though framed in an amiable manner, seemed to be piecing together details that no coworker would normally need to know. I was just curious, he'd insist with an almost imperceptible edge whenever I hesitated. I began to feel as if he were cataloging every word I said, his eyes tracking my reactions with unnerving precision. The more I noticed, the more my intuition screamed that something wasn't right. The turning point came on a humid summer evening when I left the office later than usual. I took a shortcut through a narrow side street, one I'd used many times without incident. As I walked, I became aware of a presence trailing behind me. I quickened my pace, convinced that I was simply letting my imagination run wild. But then I heard soft footsteps matching mine. When I finally dared to glance over my shoulder, there he was, a few paces behind, his expression unreadable, his eyes fixed on me with a familiarity that sent chills down my spine. I forced a smile, hoping to diffuse any tension, but inside, panic was already taking hold. I hurried to my car and didn't stop driving until I reached the safety of my apartment. That night, the unease only deepened. I discovered small signs that he had been near my home. Footprints in the damp earth outside my door, a neatly folded piece of paper with my name scrawled in hurried handwriting left on my windshield. The messages weren't overt threats, yet they carried a menacing undertone that I couldn't ignore. Every encounter with him had been laced with a subtle, invasive curiosity that gradually shifted into something far more sinister. His compliments became oddly possessive, his questions probing, as though he were trying to unlock parts of my life that I'd never willingly shared. I started to document every odd interaction in a journal. Every time he appeared in a place I frequented, every unnerving compliment, every offhand comment that left me feeling exposed. I even took to changing my routine, altering my commute, varying my lunch spot, and even rearranging my apartment in hopes of outsmarting this growing sense of dread. Yet, no matter what I did, his presence seemed to persist like an unwanted shadow. Even in public spaces crowded with strangers, I couldn't help but feel that he was watching, waiting for a moment of vulnerability. The realization that my safety might be in jeopardy was both horrifying and paralyzing. I eventually confided in a close friend about my escalating encounters. She listened intently, but, with a shrug, suggested that perhaps I was reading too much into a series of coincidences. "Maybe he's just a little too friendly," she said, her tone laced with the kind of skepticism that dismisses genuine fear. But I knew what I had seen, those eyes, that measured tone, and deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was an undercurrent of control in his behavior. It was as if he was not merely interested in my life, but in orchestrating it, subtly bending circumstances to his will. One night, after a particularly long day at work, I returned to find a single envelope tucked under my door. Inside was a handwritten note that simply read, "I know you." No signature, no further explanation, just those 3 words that made my blood run cold. I spent the rest of the night barricaded in my apartment, the note serving as a grim reminder that my instincts were not unfounded. Every creak in the hallway, every shadow at the edge of my vision now screamed of the possibility that this stranger's intentions were far from benign. Now, as I sit in the dim glow of my living room lamp, I can't help but question everything. Is this man truly dangerous, or have I allowed my growing fear to warp an otherwise innocuous situation? The line between genuine threat and paranoid misinterpretation has blurred beyond recognition. I no longer feel entirely safe, even in familiar settings. His presence, subtle yet invasive, haunts my every step, leaving me to wonder if I'm merely overreacting, or if he is orchestrating a silent campaign to control the narrative of my life. I leave this account with an open question. Was I right to fear him, or have I simply misread the signals of an overly inquisitive stranger? One thing I know for sure is that the unsettling feeling he instilled in me will not fade away easily. And somewhere out there, in the mundane tapestry of everyday life, he could be lurking, quietly, persistently, and waiting for another chance to intrude upon someone else's reality. I always believed that reality was something solid and dependable until the subtle fractures began to appear. It started with minor things that could easily be chalked up to fatigue or a lapse in attention. One morning, as I was making my coffee, I realized that the mug I had left on the counter the previous day was missing from its usual spot. I searched the kitchen for it, eventually finding it on the living room table, as if it had been casually set there by someone I didn't know. I shrugged it off, blaming my own forgetfulness and the haze of early morning routines. Over the next few days, I began to notice more peculiarities. The same neighbor I always saw in the hallway one day appeared in an unusual guise. A man in a dark suit whom I'd never met before, standing silently by my door for a moment before disappearing into the crowd. At first, I assumed I had mistaken him for someone else, or perhaps it was just a trick of the light. But then came the odd sounds. I started hearing gentle murmurs in the background of my favorite TV show, voices speaking in low, indistinct tones that I couldn't quite decipher. They sounded eerily familiar, like fragments of conversations from a past I couldn't recall. I tried to record these sounds on my phone, but the recordings only captured static and my own anxious breathing. The anomalies escalated subtly. Everyday objects began to behave strangely. My keys, my wallet, even the remote control for my television would vanish, only to reappear in places I'd never looked. One evening, after a long day at work, I found my coat neatly folded on the stairs, despite being certain I had left it in the closet. I started keeping a journal, noting every incident meticulously in the hope that a pattern might emerge. When I mentioned these events to friends, they offered tired explanations like stress or being forgetful. Yet a small, persistent voice inside me insisted these were no ordinary coincidences. Late one rainy evening, while walking home under flickering streetlights, I noticed a woman standing alone beneath a malfunctioning lamp. Her eyes were soft and her smile gentle, but there was something hauntingly familiar about her. I approached, intending to ask if she needed help, but she melted into the rain before I could speak a word. That night, I dreamed of a place I'd never visited, a dim corridor lined with old photographs of people whose faces I recognized without ever having met them. I awoke with a lingering sense of déjà vu, as if I had been somewhere important, though the details remained frustratingly out of reach. The most unsettling moment came the next morning when I found a photograph lying on my doorstep. It was a candid shot of me, taken from an angle I had never seen before, with a blurred figure standing ominously behind. My heart pounded as I examined the image, straining to catch a glimpse of the stranger's features. The back of the photograph bore a date that preceded my arrival in the city and a single, cryptic word, remember. Suddenly, I began to question my own sanity. Were these events mere hallucinations born of exhaustion? Or was someone, or something, truly orchestrating these moments? I increased my vigilance, installing extra cameras in my apartment and altering my daily routine in hopes of capturing definitive proof. Yet each attempt only deepened the mystery. Nights became restless and fraught with unease. The boundaries between waking life and dreams began to blur. I'd catch fleeting glimpses of that same man in a dark suit watching me from across the street, his expression inscrutable. Sometimes, I would hear the soft echo of his footsteps even when I was alone in my apartment. The comforting hum of my everyday life now carried an undercurrent of menace. One particularly unnerving day, while reviewing my notes and recordings, I found evidence that defied logical explanation. A series of timestamps correlated with moments when I was entirely absorbed in mundane tasks, a routine phone call, a solitary walk in the park. Yet on video, vague figures drifted in and out of the frame. The same distant whisper repeated, always just at the edge of my perception. I reached out to a local audio expert, but he dismissed my concerns as technical glitches and paranoid overreactions. His detached skepticism only fueled my growing fear that I was not merely misinterpreting events, but perhaps experiencing something altogether real. Days now merge into one another as I struggle to maintain some semblance of normalcy, though each passing hour brings new signs that the line between reality and imagination is dissolving. I recall a morning when, while preparing breakfast, I heard a familiar laugh, a laugh I recognized from a long-forgotten memory. I turned to see no one, but for a brief, disorienting moment, the reflection in my window revealed a child running past, waving as if beckoning me. I blinked, and the vision was gone. Was it a stray hallucination or a ghost of my past? I cannot say. Every sound and sight now feels suspect. A misplaced book on my desk, a soft footstep in the hallway when I'm alone. Even the chill that seems to seep from nowhere have become markers of an unseen presence. My dreams fill with half-remembered conversations in unfamiliar languages and cryptic warnings that vanish upon waking. The sensation of being observed is constant, as if invisible eyes track my every move. I find myself speaking aloud into empty rooms, desperately clinging to rationality, even as the inexplicable continues to accumulate. I've started to question the very fabric of my memories. Conversations I recall in vivid detail, are contradicted by messages I review later. Familiar events seem altered, as if someone is rewriting my personal history bit by bit. Every rational explanation dissolves under the weight of mounting evidence. I reached out to professionals, to friends, yet their reassurances about stress and overwork only deepen my isolation. They cannot see the shifting shadows behind my eyes or hear the whispers that haunt the dead of night. Now, as I document these final moments of clarity, I am left with a gnawing uncertainty. Every inexplicable event, every glimpse of the unknown, raises more questions than it answers. I wonder if the anomalies I experience are simply the residue of an overactive imagination or the manifestations of something far more sinister. The line between reality and delusion has blurred beyond recognition, leaving me at a crossroads. One path toward truth, the other into the depths of my own unraveling mind. I write these words as both a record and a plea. If anyone ever stumbles upon them, know that I search for logic amid chaos, even as the world around me slowly slipped into the realm of the inexplicable. Every night, as I lie in bed, the darkness presses in and reality seems to unravel further. The soft hum of the refrigerator becomes a low murmur, as though speaking directly to me, while the creaking floorboards echo like a heartbeat from another time. In those moments, I imagine that closing my eyes might finally free me from the relentless parade of anomalies. Yet when I wake, the remnants of that other world, the fleeting images, the distant whispers, remain etched in my mind like scars. I have tried to document every occurrence in hopes of discovering a pattern, but the more I observe, the less I trust my own senses. Now, I am left with a persistent dread that perhaps these events are not confined solely to my troubled imagination. As I record these final thoughts, I am haunted by the possibility that if I stop searching, the anomalies might vanish into a void, or perhaps they will only grow stronger, forever blurring the line between what is real and what is imagined. I can only wonder, have I been living in a parallel truth all along, one that I can never fully comprehend? I was returning home from a late shift one chilly autumn night when I first encountered him. I had taken my usual shortcut through the parking lot of the old industrial complex, a shortcut that, until that night, had always been uneventful. The lot was dimly lit by flickering fluorescent lights, and the air held an uneasy stillness that I attributed to the season. I was nearly home when I noticed a man leaning against a battered delivery truck. At first, he appeared to be just another night shift worker waiting for his ride. But as I walked past, he lifted his gaze. His eyes were fixed on me with a disconcerting intensity, and for a fleeting moment, I felt as if he had memorized every detail of my face. I quickened my pace, dismissing it as paranoia. The next day at work, I couldn't shake the memory of his unnerving stare. I tried to convince myself that it was a one-off, but small details began to emerge that made my skin crawl. In the cafeteria, a coworker mentioned a strange guy seen lingering by the loading docks during late shifts, someone who'd been asking odd questions about employees' schedules and habits. I hesitated, but the description matched him too closely to be a coincidence. I shrugged it off, rationalizing that I was simply tired from working overtime. Yet, that night, as I drove home along an empty stretch of highway, I caught a glimpse of a figure standing under a street lamp, watching me intently. I wasn't sure if it was the same man, but the thought gnawed at me. One evening, I decided to take a detour through a quieter neighborhood in hopes of shaking the growing sense of unease. I was nearly through a narrow, tree-lined street when a car slowly pulled up beside me. The driver, obscured by tinted windows, rolled down his window slightly. I caught a glimpse of eyes that mirrored that same unsettling intensity. The man uttered a single phrase in a gravelly whisper, "You shouldn't be here," before the car drifted away as silently as it had appeared. My heart pounded, and a primal urge to flee overtook any rational thought. I sped off, not daring to look back, but every mile seemed to stretch into an eternity of anxiety. The encounters escalated. I began noticing subtle, inexplicable details. A black baseball cap that I distinctly remembered leaving on my dresser reappearing on a park bench during a midday stroll. a set of footprints outside my apartment that vanished when I tried to follow them, and the persistent feeling that my phone's camera was capturing something in the background of my selfies. A dark figure, always at the edge of the frame, watching silently. I started to document these occurrences, convinced that they weren't figments of my imagination, but signals that something was terribly off. Every recorded moment only deepened the mystery, leaving me with more questions than answers. It was during a late-night visit to a friend's place that the situation reached a fever pitch. I was sitting in the living room, trying to dismiss the anxiety with casual conversation, when I caught sight of him again, standing in the reflection of the window. His eyes, dark and unreadable, stared directly back at me. I excused myself and bolted out of the apartment, my friend's concerned calls muffled by my pounding heart. Outside, under the indifferent gaze of a full moon, I realized that the man was no longer confined to the shadows of my usual routes. He had infiltrated every aspect of my life. In the days that followed, I began to notice changes not just in my own perceptions, but in the behavior of those around me. People I knew well acted as if they couldn't recall events we had shared just hours earlier. A neighbor I greeted warmly on the street later looked at me with blank confusion, as if I were a stranger. Even my coworkers' recollections of our interactions seemed disjointed, as if some vital memory had been erased. I mentioned these oddities to a friend, who brushed them off as stress-induced lapses. But deep down, I knew something far more sinister was at play. My mind became a battlefield of rational thought and creeping paranoia. Every unfamiliar face, every offhand comment, every misplaced object fueled my anxiety. I began to feel like a bystander in my own life, as if my existence was being manipulated by an unseen force. Was I simply overreacting to an errant stranger, or was there a darker hand at work, orchestrating these encounters to destabilize my reality? I couldn't tell anymore. Last night, as I sat in the safety of my locked apartment, the memory of that unsettling gaze returned with renewed force. I stared out into the night, half expecting to see him lurking in the shadows just beyond my window. And for a moment, I thought I did. A fleeting silhouette, standing motionless under the streetlight across the road. I couldn't be sure if it was real or another trick of my anxious mind, but the chill it sent down my spine was undeniable. Now, as I write these words, I'm haunted by the knowledge that this man could be anywhere, blending into the fabric of everyday life. I've learned that the strange and the dangerous don't always announce themselves with overt threats. Sometimes they linger in the periphery, waiting for the moment when you're most vulnerable. I can't shake the feeling that my encounter was not an isolated incident, but part of something far larger, an undercurrent of unsettling events that many have experienced in silence. The possibility that he might reappear at any moment, in any crowd, or even in the comforting familiarity of my own neighborhood, is a thought that keeps me awake at night. I leave this account not as a plea for help, but as a warning. Trust your instincts, no matter how insignificant the incident may seem at first. Because one day, you might find yourself face to face with a stranger whose quiet menace leaves you questioning everything you thought you knew about safety and reality. And remember, this might not be the only encounter of its kind. There are whispers of similar experiences, tales shared in hushed tones, of figures who vanish as quickly as they appear. In the end, the fear isn't just about that man. It's the realization that danger can be as mundane as a passing glance, and as pervasive as the shadows that follow you home. It started with my apartment. At least I think it did. One night, I came home from work, exhausted from an endless day of meetings, and something felt off. Not immediately, not in a way I could put my finger on, but a creeping, subtle wrongness. The kind of feeling you get when you sense someone standing behind you, only to turn and find nothing there. The first thing I noticed was my couch. It was in the exact same spot as always, pushed against the far wall beneath the window. But the fabric was different. I had owned that couch for years, long enough to know the feel of it under my fingertips. But that night, when I collapsed onto it, the material was rougher, the color slightly duller than I remembered. It should have been soft, slightly worn from years of use, but instead it felt stiff, almost new. I convinced myself I was imagining things. Maybe it was the light, or maybe I was just too tired to think straight. But as I moved around my apartment that night, more little details stood out. The lamp on my desk had a small chip on its base that I had always meant to fix, but suddenly it was pristine. The picture frame on my nightstand, the one that held a photo of me and my sister at the beach, was missing its usual scratch along the glass. At first, I told myself it was my memory playing tricks on me. The mind fills in gaps, smooths over details. Maybe I had never noticed these things properly before. That's what I told myself, at least. Then, the changes started happening outside. I was walking to my usual coffee shop the next morning when I noticed that the bookstore on the corner had a new sign. It was small, wooden, with gold lettering that read Whitaker's Books and More. I frowned, because that wasn't right. The bookstore had always been called Bellamy's Books, and I knew that for a fact. I had been shopping there for years. When I stepped inside, the layout was completely different. The wooden shelves that used to line the left wall were now on the right. The little reading nook in the back, the one with the cozy armchairs and warm lighting, was gone. Instead, there were cold metal shelves filled with office supplies, things I was certain they had never sold before. I asked the woman at the counter, a friendly older lady who had always greeted me by name, about the changes. But when I brought up the store's name, she only blinked at me. "It's always been Whitaker's," she said, as if I had just asked her if the sky was blue. I felt my stomach tighten. It used to be Bellamy's. Just last week, She laughed, but there was something strange about it. Something that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You must be thinking of somewhere else, dear." I left without buying anything. At work, things were normal at first. But then, during lunch, my coworker Steve sat across from me in the break room and started talking about his dog. Steve didn't have a dog. I knew this because we had spoken about it before. He had a cat, a big orange tabby named Milo that he constantly showed pictures of. I even remembered him telling me he was allergic to dogs, so he could never own one. But now, he was talking about how he had just adopted a black Labrador named Benny. He even pulled out his phone to show me pictures. Clear, undeniable proof that the dog existed. I forced a smile, nodding, but I could feel my pulse in my throat. "Didn't you have a cat?" I asked carefully. Steve gave me an odd look. "A cat? No, I've never had a cat." I felt like the air had been knocked out of me. That night, I sat in my apartment and made a list of everything that had changed. The couch feels different. The lamp is unchipped. The picture frame is fixed. The bookstore has a new name. Steve has a dog instead of a cat. The next morning, I woke up to find that list missing. I tore through my apartment looking for it, but it was gone. The notebook I had written in it was still there, but that page had been ripped out. I checked my phone. Maybe I had taken a picture of it. But no, my camera roll was empty. The walls of my apartment seemed to close in on me. I tried calling my sister, the one from the photo, to talk to her about it. I needed to hear a familiar voice, someone who would remind me that I wasn't losing my mind. But when she picked up, she sounded different. She was still my sister. She still had the same name, the same voice, the same laugh. But the way she spoke to me felt distant, like she was humoring me. I told her about the bookstore, about Steve, about all the little things that felt wrong. "You always did have a wild imagination," she said lightly. That wasn't how she talked to me. That wasn't how she had ever talked to me. I stared at my phone long after she hung up, my fingers numb. The days passed, and the changes kept happening. My favorite diner changed its menu overnight. The front door of my apartment, which used to creak loudly whenever I opened it, now swung silently on perfect hinges. My coworkers started mentioning memories we had shared that I couldn't recall, while completely forgetting things I knew had happened. And the worst part? No one else noticed. I started feeling like an outsider in my own life, like I had somehow slipped through the cracks into a version of the world where everything was slightly, horribly off. The changes were never drastic enough to make people think I was crazy, but just enough to make me doubt everything I knew. Then, one night, I woke up and saw someone standing at the foot of my bed. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The figure was shadowed, featureless in the dark, but I could feel them watching me, studying me. And then, they spoke. "You weren't supposed to notice." I blacked out. When I woke up, the room was empty. Everything looked normal. The walls, the furniture, my reflection in the mirror. But the feeling remained. That gnawing, suffocating sense that something was watching. Something that had been watching for a long time. I don't know what's happening to me. I don't know if I've fallen into some warped version of reality, or if I was never in the right one to begin with. But I do know one thing. Every day, something else changes. And every day, I feel like I'm getting further and further away from the world I once knew. I moved into my new apartment on a quiet street in early September. It wasn't anything special, just a small one-bedroom in an old, slightly worn-out building. But it was affordable, and after months of searching, I was just grateful to have a place to call my own. The first few days were uneventful, filled with unpacking boxes, arranging furniture, and getting used to the creaky floors and occasional flickering light. The neighbors seemed polite but distant, the kind of people who kept to themselves, which was fine by me. Then I met the woman in 2B. It was late one evening when I was taking out the trash, and she was standing just outside the building, staring at the sky. She was probably in her late 40s with shoulder-length brown hair and a worn, tired look on her face. When she noticed me, she gave a small smile and said, "You just moved in, didn't you?" I nodded, and she exhaled, almost like she had been expecting me. "Just be careful at night," she said after a pause. "This place has a way of making people feel watched." I forced a laugh. "You mean like ghosts?" Her expression darkened. "No, not ghosts." Then, without another word, she turned and went back inside. It left me feeling uneasy, but I told myself she was probably just one of those eccentric neighbors who liked to mess with a new tenant. But over the next few weeks, I started noticing small, unsettling things. It began with sounds. Faint, almost imperceptible scratching noises coming from the walls at odd hours of the night. At first, I assumed it was mice or the usual quirks of an old building. But as the nights passed, the sounds became more distinct. Sometimes it sounded like someone whispering just beyond the walls, words too soft to make out. Other times, I could swear I heard light tapping, like fingertips pressing rhythmically against the drywall. Then there were the missing objects. I'd leave my keys on the kitchen counter, only to find them on my nightstand. A book I had been reading disappeared completely, only to turn up days later on the floor of my closet. I started to doubt myself, thinking maybe I was just misplacing things, but the more it happened, the more I felt like something was deliberately moving them. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard someone knock at my door. Not a loud, urgent knock, just a slow, deliberate tap. Tap, tap. When I looked through the peephole, there was no one there. I opened the door and stepped into the dimly lit hallway, but it was empty. Just as I was about to go back inside, I heard a soft creak from further down the hall. The woman from 2B was standing in her doorway, watching me. I felt my stomach tighten. "Did you hear that?" I asked. She nodded slowly, her eyes darting toward the end of the hall. "You shouldn't open your door at night," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes it's better not to answer." I wanted to ask her what she meant, but she quickly shut her door, the sound of the lock clicking into place echoing down the corridor. That was the night I started sleeping with the lights on. Things escalated after that. One evening, as I was heading out, I saw a man standing just outside the building, staring directly up at my apartment window. He was tall, wearing a dark hoodie, his hands stuffed in his pockets. Something about the way he stood so still, so unnaturally rigid, sent a shiver down my spine. I hesitated before stepping outside, hoping he would move or acknowledge me in some way, but he didn't. He just kept staring. I quickly walked past him, keeping my head down, but as I rounded the corner, I glanced back. He was gone. I told myself it was just some random guy, maybe a loiterer or someone waiting for a friend. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that he had been there for a reason. Watching, waiting. A few nights later, I woke up suddenly to the sensation of movement in my apartment. I lay frozen listening, my breath shallow. It was subtle, just the faintest shift of air, the quiet creak of a floorboard. My heart pounded as I slowly reached for my phone, my fingers shaking as I turned on the flashlight. The room was empty. The door was still locked, but something felt wrong. I sat up, scanning the room, when my eyes landed on my closet door. It was open, just an inch, barely enough to notice. but I knew for a fact that I had closed it before going to bed. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I went to talk to the landlord, asking if anyone had reported strange activity in the building. He gave me a confused look and shook his head. "You're the only tenant who's lived in that unit for a long time," he said. "Most people don't stay there very long." "Why?" I asked, my stomach tightening. He hesitated. "People say they feel uncomfortable, that someone's watching them, but there's never been any proof of anything unusual." That was when I decided to leave. I started packing that same day, not even caring about breaking my lease. I just wanted out. But the night before I was set to move, I had one final experience, one that still makes my skin crawl to this day. I was taping up a box when I heard it again, the whispering. But this time, it wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from inside my apartment. I turned slowly, every muscle in my body tense. The whispering stopped. The room was silent. Then, from behind me in the doorway to my bedroom, I heard it. A low, raspy breath. I didn't turn around. I didn't look. I grabbed my keys and ran. I spent the night in my car, parked in a well-lit lot miles away. By morning, I had a moving truck ready, and within hours, I was gone. I didn't even care if I left things behind. I just wanted to get out of that place. I never found out what was really happening in that apartment. Maybe it was just paranoia, maybe it was something more. But sometimes, when I'm alone in my new place, I swear I still hear faint tapping on the walls. And I wonder, did I leave whatever was in that apartment behind? Or did it follow me? I first encountered him on a rainy evening during my first week in the new city. I had just moved into a modest apartment near the central station, eager to start fresh after years of routine in a small town. That night, as I sat in a crowded bus shelter waiting for my ride home, I noticed a man leaning casually against a lamppost. He had a warm smile and an unassuming demeanor, and when our eyes met, he nodded in greeting in a way that felt sincere. I assumed he was simply another resident of the city, and his kindness in that brief moment left me with a small, comforting spark in an otherwise gloomy night. Over the next few days, I began to see him again. It was at the local coffee shop where I'd started my mornings. I was reading a book by the window when he entered, and though he didn't approach me immediately, he chose a seat at a table where I could see him clearly. Later that morning, as I stepped out to collect my order, he called softly, "Enjoying your day?" The tone was friendly, even intimate, as if he already knew me well. I laughed it off, replying with a casual greeting before returning to my seat. Yet, as the day wore on, a strange sensation crept in, a feeling that I wasn't alone in more ways than one. That evening, while walking back to my apartment along the river, I caught sight of him again, standing under the glow of a street lamp near the park entrance. He didn't speak, merely watched me pass, and for a moment, our eyes locked in a silent acknowledgement. I tried to convince myself it was a coincidence, a stray familiar face in a bustling city, but an undercurrent of unease began to build inside me. It was as if each time I turned a corner, I expected to see his calm, steady gaze following me, even if only in my peripheral vision. As the weeks progressed, our encounters became disturbingly regular. I'd be waiting at the bus stop early in the morning or grabbing a quick bite at the local diner when I'd see him, always at the same time, always in the same places. At first, his approach was always casual. Once, while I was leaving a bookstore, he approached with a kind smile and said, "I noticed you admiring that rare edition. It's one of my favorites, too." His comment was thoughtful, and for a moment I felt a connection, as if he understood my passions better than anyone had before. But then he added, "I remember you mentioned you'd been looking for it," and I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I hadn't mentioned such a thing to anyone, not even to the friendly clerk behind the counter. How could he know? I started to feel as though my life was slowly being scripted by this enigmatic stranger. He would appear in places I frequented, sometimes in the background of my daily errands, other times boldly inserting himself into my conversations. At a friend's small dinner party, he arrived unannounced, dressed in the same unremarkable style as always, and casually commented on details about my recent struggles at work. "I heard you're having a tough time," he said with unsettling precision, as though he had been eavesdropping on my private phone call just moments before. His words were laced with a disturbing intimacy, hinting at knowledge I had carefully guarded. The more he appeared, the more I began to notice small details that didn't add up. On one occasion, after a particularly stressful day, I returned home to find a folded piece of paper placed on my doormat. It simply read, "I know your routine." I felt exposed, as if every step I took was under scrutiny. I changed my habits, taking different routes and altering my schedule, but no matter what I did, he was always there, a constant, unyielding presence at the edges of my vision. At times, I would catch him standing on the opposite side of the street, his eyes locked on mine with an intensity that belied his otherwise friendly appearance. Emotionally, I was unraveling. I began to dread the moments when I would be alone, when the quiet of my apartment would be broken by the thought of him lurking somewhere nearby. Sleep became a fragmented tapestry of anxious dreams and restless nights. My phone vibrated with messages from concerned friends, urging me to seek help or at least to be cautious. But I couldn't bring myself to explain what was happening. How do you describe the feeling of being observed by someone who seems to slip effortlessly in and out of your life, leaving no trace yet knowing every detail about you? Desperation drove me to try and uncover his identity. I revisited every location where I'd seen him, reviewed blurry security camera footage from the coffee shop, and even inquired with the staff at the bookstore. Each time, the people I spoke to confirmed that he was just another regular, a quiet, unobtrusive man who seemed perfectly ordinary. Yet nothing about his actions felt ordinary to me. Every encounter, every unsolicited remark, every whispered piece of knowledge that he seemingly gathered from the shadows painted a picture of someone orchestrating an elaborate, invasive presence in my life. Now, as I write this, I sit in the dim light of my living room, heart pounding with a mix of fear and confusion. I am left to wonder, is it merely a series of coincidences, a trick of my anxious mind, or is someone truly tracking me, piecing together details of my existence in a way that is both intimate and disturbing? The stranger's friendly facade masks something far more sinister, a relentless intrusion that leaves me feeling powerless and exposed. I have no answers, only a haunting question that echoes in every silent moment. Was I just overreacting, or is someone out there, lurking in the background, watching my every move? I was always a practical person, preferring logic over superstition. I was surprised when the quiet, unassuming town of Ashwood called me to live in a modest, aged house that seemed to have been forgotten by time. I didn't think much of the rumors that swirled around its history, dismissing them as nothing more than local folklore. Yet, as soon as I stepped through the creaking door, an inexplicable heaviness settled in my bones, as if the walls themselves remembered secrets best left undisturbed. At first, it was the little things, a barely audible whisper in the dead of night, shadows shifting just beyond the corner of my eye, and objects inexplicably moving from where I had left them. I chalked it up to my imagination, a trick of the mind after too many lonely nights. But then came the night I truly could no longer ignore it. I awoke around 3 a.m. to a persistent tapping on the window. I sat frozen, heart pounding, convinced that my mind was conjuring phantom sounds. Mustering every ounce of courage, I approached the window. Outside, the world was shrouded in a silvery mist, and no figure stood in the rain. Yet the tapping persisted, as if someone or something was patiently beckoning me. In the following weeks, the disturbances grew insistent. Every night at precisely the same hour, I heard the echo of footsteps pacing the hallway, followed by the soft murmur of voices, too quiet to decipher. One evening, compelled by equal parts terror and curiosity, I followed the sound down the long, narrow corridor lined with peeling wallpaper. At the base of the staircase, the voices faded into an eerie silence. I turned sharply and caught a glimpse of a figure disappearing into the murk of the attic. My heart pounded in protest. For an instant, I saw not a person but a gaunt presence, its eyes hollow and unseeing, as if absorbing every stray beam of light. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over a worn rug as a sudden, icy gust of wind rushed past me, a warning perhaps from forces I couldn't hope to comprehend. Desperate for answers, I began poring over local archives and dusty records, learning that a family had vanished from this very house in the early 1900s. Faded letters hidden in a crumbling crevice of the fireplace mentioned an unseen presence tormenting the household, a presence that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. The letters ended abruptly, leaving a void filled with unanswered questions. I couldn't help but feel that my arrival had stirred something best left dormant, something that now haunted every crevice of my new home. Soon after, my nights were plagued by vivid dreams in which I wandered endless corridors whose walls shifted and morphed into impossible geometries. In these nocturnal visions, the house itself came alive, trapping me in a maze where each door led to a deeper, unfathomable dread. I awoke drenched in sweat, the echo of ghostly voices lingering long after the images had faded. One morning, I discovered deep scratch marks on the wall near the attic door, scratches that formed a frantic, almost indecipherable plea for mercy. I couldn't tell whether these marks were the desperate act of a long-departed soul or the handiwork of the very entity that now tormented me. Then, late one night, as I sat reading in my study, the lights flickered and died, plunging me into oppressive darkness. In that heavy silence, a soft, rhythmic hum began, as though the house itself were breathing. Moonlight, seeping in through a window, revealed a shadowed figure standing in the far corner of the room. It was motionless, its eyes locked on mine with an intensity that sent shivers coursing down my spine. I tried to call out, but fear had stolen my voice. The figure slowly raised a pale hand and pointed toward a hidden passage behind the bookshelf. Drawn by an inexplicable compulsion mingled with terror, I stepped toward it. Behind lay a narrow, dust-choked staircase descending into a subterranean chamber. With each hesitant step downward, the air grew colder and the silence thicker. Faint murmurs, low and sorrowful, rose from beneath, as if the very foundation of the house was whispering secrets too horrible to hear. Inside the chamber, my eyes fell on a wall covered in strange symbols and cryptic messages that pulsed with a feeble, eerie glow. In the center was a circular imprint, as if something had been pressed against it with immense force. A wave of dread washed over me, the sense that I had trespassed into a realm that straddled the line between the living and the dead. The whispers escalated into a single, anguished wail that filled my mind with unbearable sorrow. I fled back up the staircase, the echo of that mournful cry etching itself into my very soul long after I reached the fragile safety of my study. Ever since that night, I've been plagued by the sensation of unseen eyes tracking my every move. The house no longer feels like a sanctuary, but a sentient entity, its malignant presence lurking in every shadow. I've tried to leave, packing my bags, only to be met by a force, a cold, insistent grip that drags me back. My days have become an endless blur of restless moments and inexplicable disturbances. Objects rearranged in defiant patterns, reflections in mirrors that do not match my trembling face, and, sometimes, the fleeting sensation of a cold hand brushing against my cheek just as I begin to sleep. I started to question my sanity, wondering if isolation had twisted my mind. But then, last week, I uncovered a dusty diary in a hidden corner of the attic. Its pages chronicled the tormented life of a woman who had lived here a century ago, her final entries filled with dread and desperate warnings about a presence she called the Watcher. She wrote of a relentless observer that had haunted her every moment, an entity that consumed hope and replaced it with despair. The diary's final, desperate plea read, "If you read this, know that I tried to leave, but the house will not let me. It has claimed me, body and soul." I shudder to think that her words were not merely the ramblings of a broken mind, but a true account of an ancient force that now held me in its thrall. Now, as I sit in the wavering glow of a single lamp, I can still feel the weight of unseen eyes upon me. The house watches from every darkened corner, its silent vigilance unyielding. Even as I write these words, a desperate attempt to document my ordeal, I cannot shake the feeling that I am being recorded by something beyond my understanding. Last night, I awoke to find a single, weathered photograph on my bedside table. It depicted the very woman from the diary, her eyes wide with terror, as if she knew her fate was sealed. Beneath the photo, in faded ink, were the words, "He sees all." The phrase echoed the spectral murmurs that had become the soundtrack of my nights. I now suspect that the watcher is not merely a ghost of the past, but a predatory force that feeds on fear, a presence that has claimed every soul unfortunate enough to cross its threshold. I have no answers, only a mounting terror that grows with each passing day and a lingering sense that the true horror of this house is far from being fully revealed. Even now, in the oppressive silence, I can hear the faintest footfall behind me, a reminder that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, and some doors, once opened, are never truly closed. I first noticed something was off on an ordinary Tuesday morning when I couldn't find my wallet. I distinctly remembered placing it on the entry table before leaving for work, yet when I returned that evening, it was gone. I searched every corner of my small apartment until I discovered it tucked behind a cushion on the sofa, a place I had no recollection of ever using. I told myself it was a simple lapse, the result of a distracted mind, but a subtle unease began to creep in. Over the following days, small discrepancies accumulated like loose threads in a well-worn sweater. A neighbor I always exchanged nods with in the hallway started greeting me with a polite smile that vanished as quickly as it appeared, and when I mentioned our previous friendly chatter, they insisted nothing had happened at all. At first, these odd moments were easily dismissed as coincidences or mere quirks of everyday life. A misplaced set of keys here, a forgotten conversation there. But soon, the inconsistencies escalated in ways that made my heart race. On one evening, while returning home from the grocery store, I encountered a man who looked strikingly familiar, almost as if he were an echo of someone from my past. I greeted him casually, expecting recognition, but he simply stared blankly and walked on as if I were invisible. When I later mentioned the encounter to a close friend, she looked at me quizzically, insisting that I had been mistaken. She was certain she had seen the same man only weeks ago in a very different context, and he had spoken warmly to her then. The strangeness deepened further when I began to notice people around me acting as if recent events never occurred. I remember discussing plans for a weekend outing with a coworker, only for her to act as though our conversation had been months old. Even my own recollection of events became fragmented. I started keeping a detailed journal, noting every minor anomaly, every lost item, every odd remark, but the entries themselves seemed to shift. I would write about a conversation I'd had in the living room, only to find the next morning that the details were inexplicably altered, as if someone had rewritten my memories while I slept. One particularly unsettling evening, I returned home early from work. The apartment was dimly lit, and the air felt heavy with a quiet tension I couldn't explain. As I passed by the mirror in the hallway, I caught a glimpse of a figure standing behind me, a person whose features I recognized only as a faded memory from childhood. I spun around, but no one was there. My pulse pounded as I rationalized that my mind was playing tricks on me, a side effect of stress and exhaustion. Yet, deep down, I felt that the boundaries of my reality were being manipulated by something beyond my control. I began to notice patterns that were increasingly difficult to dismiss. Every time I revisited a familiar location, a coffee shop, a park bench, even the local library, I encountered faces that seemed momentarily unfamiliar, as if they were trying to hide a shared secret. Conversations would halt mid-sentence when I approached, and people would exchange glances laden with silent apologies, as if aware that something was amiss. At work, files on my desk would shift positions, and co-workers' accounts of recent events would contradict one another, leaving me to wonder if I was living in a fragmented replay of my own life. I felt increasingly like a bystander, watching events unfold without any real participation or control. The final unraveling came one rainy night when I heard the faint sound of a familiar melody drifting through the empty corridors of my building, a tune my mother used to hum during my childhood. Drawn by the sound, I followed it to the stairwell, where I caught a glimpse of a shadow moving against the flickering light. In that brief, heart-stopping moment, the shadow paused as if acknowledging my presence, then continued on its path. Later, when I recounted the experience to a friend, she insisted that I had not mentioned any such sound before, as if my recollection was being selectively erased. The idea that someone or something was tampering with my memories, or even rewriting reality itself, became all too real. Now, as I sit alone in the quiet of my apartment, every creak of the floorboard and every whisper of the wind feels laden with hidden meaning. I have tried to rationalize these events as the result of stress, fatigue, or an overactive imagination. Yet the evidence continues to mount. A lost wallet reappearing in inexplicable places, conversations that seem to vanish from others' recollections, and subtle changes in people I thought I knew well. My attempts to document the strange occurrences only seem to deepen the mystery, as if the act of observation causes reality to shift in unpredictable ways. I write these words in a desperate bid to make sense of it all, though even I am beginning to doubt the solidity of my own memories. Every day, I wake up wondering if what I experienced was real, or if I am slowly losing my grip on a reality that once made sense. Tonight, as I glance out the window at a world that feels both familiar and utterly alien, I am left with one haunting question. Am I simply a victim of a fractured mind, or is there something else? An unseen force rewriting my life, lurking in the spaces between memory and reality? I have no clear answers, only a persistent sense that the truth lies somewhere just beyond my reach, waiting to be discovered, or perhaps forever hidden in the shifting shadows of my existence. I moved into a modest apartment on a quiet street, expecting nothing more than the usual hassles of a new place. Unpacking boxes, adjusting to creaky floors, and discovering a few quirks of an old building. The unit was small and plain, with chipped paint and a persistent mustiness that I assumed was typical for a place built decades ago. I told myself that every new beginning had its minor inconveniences, and I quickly set about making the space my own. The first few nights passed without incident. I spent my evenings reading on a worn-out couch and listening to the hum of the city through a half-open window. But on the fourth night, while I was sorting through some mail at the kitchen table, I heard a faint tapping from the hallway. I paused, heart thumping, and listened. The sound was steady, yet barely perceptible, like someone gently drumming their fingers on the wood. I shrugged it off as the building settling, or perhaps an errant branch scraping against the window frame. Still, the sound wouldn't let me be. As days turned into a week, small oddities began to pile up. I found a book from my shelf, moved to the windowsill, and on another morning, I awoke to the sound of soft shuffling in the corridor. One night, after a long day at work, I sat down in the living room only to see a dark silhouette pass behind the half-closed door. I forced a rational explanation. It was a neighbor returning home late, or perhaps my tired eyes had deceived me. But a gnawing unease took root. Determined to find a logical explanation, I set up my phone on a tripod to record any unusual sounds overnight. When I reviewed the footage the next morning, I discovered moments of unexplained static and, disturbingly, a whisper that wasn't mine. I adjusted the sensitivity, convinced that the building's old wiring or the nearby subway might be causing interference. I even mentioned it to my friend Sam, who reassured me that old structures have their own voices, though his laughter did little to ease my mind. Things escalated slowly. The occasional odd noise became a nightly occurrence. One evening, I came home to find my keys arranged in a pattern on the hallway table, forming a shape that resembled a crude arrow pointing toward the closet. I dismissed it as a prank by a mischievous neighbor, until I received no confirmation of any such individual living in the building. I began to document every incident meticulously, writing down times, dates, and my attempts at rational explanations. Yet the evidence grew more perplexing. Footage from my makeshift surveillance showed fleeting images of a figure standing near the doorway, but only for a split second before it vanished, leaving behind nothing but the lingering impression of dread. I visited the local library to research the building's history, hoping to find some mundane explanation for the occurrences. I learned that in the 1960s, a tenant by the name of Evelyn had mysteriously disappeared from this very apartment. Newspaper clippings were sparse and vague, with no concrete details beyond rumors of strange lights and hushed conversations among neighbors. Some speculated that Evelyn had been the victim of an overactive imagination fueled by isolation, while others whispered about forces that defied explanation. The more I learned, the more I questioned whether my own experiences were connected to her tragic story. Late one stormy night, I sat in my living room trying to work through the jumble of evidence. The lights flickered, and an inexplicable coldness swept through the room, as if a presence had suddenly entered. In that moment, I distinctly heard a low murmur, like a chant, emerging from behind the wall. My heart pounded as I edged closer, flashlight in hand. The sound grew louder, but when I reached the source, I found nothing but a dull, oppressive silence. I recorded the incident, convinced that if I could gather enough data, I could prove that there was a logical explanation lurking beneath these inexplicable phenomena. But logic began to crumble when my apartment itself seemed to rebel against my efforts. Doors that I had locked would be found ajar the next morning, and familiar objects would appear in places I did not recall leaving them. One morning, I awoke to see a row of smudged fingerprints trailing from my bedroom door to the living room window. I attempted to show these photos to friends and even to a local building inspector, but they could only offer polite skepticism and tired assurances that it was nothing more than coincidence or a trick of the light. Now, as I write these words in the dim glow of a single lamp, I remain trapped in a limbo between rational thought and mounting terror. The evidence of my experiences, recordings, photographs, and detailed journal entries, paints a picture that defies all logical explanation. I find myself haunted by questions. Was Evelyn's fate somehow entwined with this place? Is there a presence here that defies the laws of nature? And why do I feel that my every move is being silently observed by something unseen, waiting patiently for the moment when reason is completely abandoned? I have no clear answers, only an unsettling certainty that what I have experienced is far more complex and far more sinister than a simple series of coincidences.